Okay, check 1 2, check 1 2, testing, testing. Please comment in the chat if you can hear me. Please let me know if the audio is good, and if you have any questions throughout this, comment them in the chat. Also, if you value this content and you want to support it, please leave a comment below, or you can leave a question and I will answer you. Also, if you want to keep up with this project, please subscribe if you have not and hit the bell notification. I'm terrible at these intros, but I'm going to try and get better at them because it does sincerely help the channel, and I deeply appreciate it. So I'm very excited about this stream today. This one is an incredible discussion that is not actually that long of a stream, not necessarily this one, but the one that we're commenting on, which is linked below, which was a conversation between Stephen Wolfram and Karl Friston on the Machine Learning Street Talk podcast or YouTube channel. And I ended up just wanting to talk about every bit of this stream that they did, because there was so much just incredible information. And it was something that I honestly wish there was more of, but it's out there, which is a true conversation between two people who are working on something very, very unique, and interconnected with each other's work, but also very unique compared to what most people in their associated fields are working on. And that was very cool to see. It wasn't a debate. It was not just two people talking at each other. It was two of people, I would say, in the forefront of next-gen physics trying to understand each other. And that is very, good always. So, anyways, good. Thank you for letting me know the audio is good. So, this is the podcast and the channel that we're going to be discussing, Machine Learning Street Talk. If you haven't subscribed to them, I definitely recommend it. They do some great interviews and things. This is the one that we're going to be discussing with Stephen Wolfram and Karl Friston. We've talked about both of these two guys before, but I'm going to let the intro for each of them play for those of you who do not know. But Karl Friston, he is the originator of the free energy principle, and Stephen Wolfram created Wolfram Alpha and also is working on his Wolfram Physics project, which is a kind of a hypergraph model of physics, which is, we'll get into it. But interestingly enough, Karl Friston, his work is usually described as extremely difficult to understand, yet for some reason he's taken extremely seriously, it seems. And I think he should be. I'm just saying that it's surprising how many people say they don't get it, but then also seem to, reference his work in some respect or another. But I think it's not actually that difficult to understand. It's just different than what most of the models are, and the concepts involved with it are quite different from what most of the constraints are in mainstream science, including, especially physics. So we're going to get into it, but here. This is the first clip. It's Karl Friston's intro.
Dr. Friston, welcome back to the show. You are an esteemed British scientist who is widely recognized for groundbreaking quantitative methods to understand the human brain. A professor at the Institute of Neurology, University College London, Friston invented statistical parametric mapping and voxel-based morphometry, two neuroimaging techniques that have revolutionized the field. Dr. Friston has published over 1,000 papers in scientific journals, making him one of the most cited scientists. He is the originator of dynamic causal modeling and the much-acclaimed free energy principle, a deceptively simple and yet profoundly impactful idea that has fundamentally reshaped our understanding of the brain and living systems. More recently, he accepted a role as chief scientist at Versus AI, a company implementing cognitive computing and distributed intelligence. Welcome back to the show.
It's great to be here.
Okay, so that is Karl Friston. Next is Stephen Wolfram. and then we will get into the actual content.
Wolfram, you are a renowned British-American computer scientist, physicist, and business leader known for your considerable contributions to multiple scientific domains. As the founder and CEO of the innovative software company Wolfram Research, he developed Mathematica, a comprehensive computation environment, along with the Wolfram language, an original symbolic language that greatly alters the interaction with computation. As an early pioneer in theoretical physics, cellular automata, and complexity theory, he wrote the best-selling book, A New Kind of Science, arguing for a fundamental shift in scientific paradigms. More recently, he launched the Wolfram Physics Project, ambitiously aspiring to build up a fundamental theory of all physics from a computational foundation. For his influential work, he has achieved numerous accolades, including being the youngest MacArthur Fellowship winner. Wolfram's transformative approach continues to impact the landscape of computational science and beyond. And welcome back to the show. You've been on a few times with us now.
Yes.
Okay, so there you go. That's a better intro than I could have ever done. And so the first clip is one that is fascinating, because if you follow this channel and my work with Sentient Singularity theory quite a bit, you know that I've talked about Wolfram's work a number of times, and you probably also know a bit about his work, but there is something that he references quite a bit about how in his hypergraph model, which is a bunch of interconnected I guess nodes, you could say, in this like branching universe model, he talks about atoms of space and how that space is made of these atoms of space, essentially. And I have stated before that I think that what he will eventually state about this, that I don't know when he first started having this idea, but is that these atoms of space are sentient beings, essentially. But he would probably not say sentient beings necessarily, but he would say observers or minds or whatever, and that these are atoms of space, because sentient singularity theory shows that the emergence of space-time is due to the interaction between two minds, or two or more minds, essentially, and that the constraints and degrees of freedom of those minds that are interacting, and the constraints and degrees of freedom of their interactions themselves, basically form the picture of space-time that we see, essentially. And this is something that I have not really heard anybody else say, and I've never heard Wolfram say it until this a clip from this talk, which was pretty cool. So here.
Of gravitational radiation. And remember, all of this is built from pure computation. But like fluid mechanics emerging from molecules, what emerges here, space-time and Einstein's equations for gravity. Our computational rules can inevitably be applied in many ways, each defining a different kind of thread of time, a different path of history that can branch and merge. But as observers embedded in this universe, we're branching and merging too. And it turns out that quantum mechanics emerges as the story of how branching minds perceive a branching universe. So the little pink lines you might be able to see here show the structure of what we call branchial space, the space of quantum branches. And one of the stunningly beautiful things, at least for physicists like me, is that the same phenomenon that in physical space gives us gravity, in branchial space gives us quantum mechanics.
Guys, I don't know if there's been a better time for this, but I've been saying it. That is awesome to see. That is very cool to see that him say that. I don't know when that clip exactly was recorded that was put into this, the intro to the stream, but that is exactly correct. Quantum mechanics is due to the interaction between minds. So is relativity, essentially, but it's different because one, you're talking about it. It's I don't know if I can explain this very well right now, but one of them is more about the perception of the ambient background, and the other one is about the perception that occurs when you're focused on a specific point. And those points are called particles, elementary particles. I'm talking about electrons and and quarks and neutrinos, and I'm not speaking about atoms and molecules or things like that. I'm talking about what we call the elementary particles are actually essentially points. Some of them are focus points, and I mean, they're all essentially focus points, but some of them you could say are force points as well. They're points of force being applied, and some instances they are points of focus. And so, but this is where these symmetry structures come from, of these points that can be observed, and we put them into the standard model of quantum mechanics. And that is something that I've never heard anybody say, but myself, I'm not saying I'm the only one that has said it. I bet you that I am not, but I had not heard it yet from Wolfram, but I could definitely see that what he was saying was close. It was getting close to that, and then I finally saw that on the stream, and that was awesome. So, kudos. It's very cool. But this next clip is Wolfram describing the free energy principle. I think that it's an important one to see because the free energy principle is, for many, very difficult to understand. I think it was good to see Wolfram actually trying to understand Friston's work, which usually when you see these types of things, it's like you'll see Wolfram and Weinstein talk to each other, and it's kind of framed by everybody going into it as like this competition. At least it was in those those conversations that were occurring a year or two ago, when everybody was really obsessed with theories of everything, and it was like battle royale was kind of expected, and then it hasn't really led to anything profound because, as I've stated in my video, Theories of Everything, the How-To Guide, these theories are not actually competition, and the idea that they are is going to actually hamper everybody's progress. We need a new paradigm in which these theories can actually really be, really come into their own, I guess, and blossom. And what that takes is them being placed into context that is connected to other, concepts and applications and things like that. And so what you need then is you need a bunch of theories that have the same general principles or suggest the same general ideas that are referencing each other, essentially. And so they're not competition, they are complementary. And so you're starting to see that more now with like Kirchheim-Mungel's theolocutions. I think you see that a lot, and that's great. And this discussion on here was another great one. And it's good to see when it's not just two people trying to present their own work. It's like two people who have their own work, who are trying to understand the work of others. And that is awesome. That is how progress will be made in this specific endeavor, which is something that is hard for us to even define. And I will get more into, by the way, how this or why we see the symmetry structures in the standard model that we see according to at least sentient singularity theory, but I'm going to present that in a video that is specific to sentient singularity theory, not one in which we're also giving commentary on a stream with other people talking. So, but it's good to understand the free energy principle. There's lots and lots of similarities between the free energy principle and sentient singularity theory. The free energy principle basically has it is an attempt to understand, and we'll let Wolfram explain it here in a minute, but just given my understanding is that his models within the free energy principle are essentially the models of what he has said in this stream as the physics of sentience, so the internal physics of the dimensions of mind, essentially. And so he has in the free energy principle these Markov blankets, which are basically defining of the boundaries between observers and minds, you could say, and that there are 4 aspects to these Markov blankets, and I hope I'm getting this right, and they are inside, outside, sensing, and acting in the free energy principle, which is amazing because the backbone of sentient singularity theory is based on four primary perspectives, I call them, which is inside, outside, separate, and oneness. So it's like your perception of your relationship with another that is not within the context of space-time, or is beyond the context of space-time. So it's not bigger than, or stronger than, or faster than, or far from, or close to. All these descriptions are within the relativistic context, but if you want to understand relationships that transcend relativity, then you have to describe them differently, and the backbone of my work states that you do this by recognizing that these four primary entangled perspectives are inside, outside, separate, and oneness, and they are entangled in a way that they're completely entangled, which means that the perception of one of them means that the perception of all four. So like if you know what is separate from you, that means that you also know what's one with you, or what would be one with you, and what is inside of you and what is outside of you, because you have this boundary of you versus another. And this is essentially the same. It's not the same exact thing as the free energy principle, which is a bit more of an attempt to, I believe, show the boundaries of an observer as being essentially these Markov blankets that is only, it's not focused on only the relationships between it and another Markov blanket necessarily. It's like it and the outside world, whether that is another Markov blanket, or means another mind essentially, or it is just a building or something that's a thing and not a being. And so, and they talk a lot about things versus beings in this. So we're gonna let Wolfram give his take on the free energy principle. I hope that I did it some justice. I didn't want to go totally into it, but I hope I wasn't wrong with what I said. So.
And so on. So Steve, let me try my version of this, and then you can tell me what's horribly wrong with it. It's kind of like if you're a brain-like thing, you kind of the concept, I think, is that you want the world to be as predictable a place as possible, and that it can be predictable either because you have a great model of what's going to happen, or because you've organized your world so that it is set up to be predictable. We kind of part of what we try to achieve with technology and things is to make our lives sort of more predictable. And I suppose my assumption is that, first of all, am I roughly right in what the point is here? Or am I totally off base?
No, you're perfectly right. That's almost word for word how I would portray the sort of teleological implications of the free energy principle to psychologists and neurobiologists and other sort of theoreticians in the life sciences. I should say if I was talking to a physicist, and now I am, I just want to say that I'm only an intuitive physicist. I've forgotten all the physics I did when I was a young man. But if I were trying to explain to a physicist, then everything you said is exactly right, but inverted. So if things exist, and thingness is defined in terms of establishing some kind of synchrony or some kind of non-equilibrium steady state with everything else, or particularly the local niche in which it finds itself, then it can always be read as if it is trying to predict what is happening and, exactly as you say, engineer or design its niche as to make things more predictable. So it's one of Danden's strange inversions. So part of the simplicity of the free energy principle lies in that almost tautological framing of the free energy principle, whereby you're just saying that if something exists in harmony and in relation to its environment, then it will show these kinds of properties that can, on a certain reading, be interpreted as minimizing surprise, maximizing predictability. But there are lots of nuances, and I would like to know, how this might fit into what we were talking about before going on air, the Ruliad and your conception of how the universe unfolds, and what part of that, what slice of that constitutes the thing, the observer, and how it relates to the context in which it is evolving.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. But let me see if I can paraphrase what you just said. You basically said that for an organism to be sort of happily going along, as you said, in harmony with its environment, it is inevitable, you say, that it must have achieved this minimization of surprise, this maximization of predictability. Is that right? That's...
Okay, so there you go. And there's a lot to it, but he's basically saying that there is a being that is capable of interpreting information and using that information to act, essentially, and act and react, I guess you could say. So it is about the physics of mind, and that's why he used the example of an organism, but it essentially you'd have to apply organism, what we associate organism-like qualities onto that which is being described. So if sentient singularity theory suggests that an atom is a sentient being, which it does, then basically that the free energy principle concepts would apply, of like this being would be trying to minimize surprise and maximize the predictability of its world as it moves through its world, essentially. And it's fascinating how much it seems like people have talked around where this was eventually going to go, which is physics is going towards trying to recognize that in order to understand physics, you have to understand consciousness or sentience. I like the term sentience better. I don't like the term consciousness. But you have to understand mind. You have to understand sentience. There is no disconnect between these. And I've said this many, many times, is that, we perceive the world, the dimensions of physics even, not just even the particles which are points in the standard model, but the dimensions of the world due to the structure of our minds. And not just the dimensions of what we call physics, but also the categories in the standard model and the symmetries in the standard model, the dimensions of physics, like of space-time specifically, which is what I mean by the dimensions of physics, the 4D space-time. That is a symmetry structure. Why would you see 4D space-time? Maybe because an observer has this quadratic symmetry structure to its mentality itself, like inside, outside, separate, and oneness, or inside, outside, sensing, and acting. So these 4 aspects of a Markov blanket seem to come from 4 primary perspectives, all of which lead to, the 4 dimensions of space-time. And so I've talked about this many times, and I have models that show kind of where this comes from in sentient singularity theory, and it seems to also be the case in Karl Friston's work. If you look at geometric unity, you've got it begins in Eric Weinstein's paper, says, let us begin with a 4-dimensional manifold. It's like, why? He's not talking necessarily about space-time in that. He's talking about like a proto-space-time 4D manifold. Okay, so what is it, though? And that is where physics is going to have to go, is it's going to have to understand what is responsible for physics. And I said this in my Theory of Everything, the How-To Guide video, but it is very cool to see that people are starting to speak out loud about this. I don't know how long they've intuited this. It seems like for a bit, but this next clip is going to show that exactly what I've been saying about why we perceive 4D space-time, why we perceive the colors that we do. Why do we perceive 3 primary and 3 secondary colors? Why do we perceive 3D space? Is because of the structure of mind. And this next clip is Wolfram stating that. It's far later in the video, but it is relevant to what we're speaking about now.
Some of these distinctions are sort of core to the notion of what observers like us can be like. And I think it's interesting to try to home in, just what is the right level here, because my own guess is that some of what we perceive about the universe, so let me give an extreme example. It'll be interesting to figure out whether the fact that we perceive space to be roughly 3-dimensional is a consequence of some aspect of us as observers. It's not obvious to me. I think it's possible that that's the case. And in other words, that we could perfectly well describe the universe as being one-dimensional, where we have to chase along all these worms that sort of navigate through space, so to speak. These sort of space-filling curves arranged through space. But that would be a very weird and inefficient way for observers like us, to describe the universe. And so my this is why I'm curious about kind of what is the nature of observers, because I think that the nature of observers, once we understand it better, we're going to say, why do we see the universe the way we see it? And the answer is going to be because we happen to be observers like we are. Just as we can say, why do we see the night sky that we see? Well, it's because we happen to be at this particular place in this particular galaxy, and so on. So,
guys, there you go. I've been saying it. Like, that is, and by the way, I'm not saying this in a competitive sense. I'm ecstatic to see this. I saw this and I was like bouncing up and down in my seat, because this is what we need to start saying. And we need people who aren't just me on the internet, or someone else who is doesn't have degrees and doesn't have quite the audience to actually come to grips with this, and not just parrot it, but understand it. And Wolfram is definitely doing that. It is amazing to see, and it was the most overt kind of shift that I've seen in how he has been discussing his work, and the focus of his work. Because it's one thing to talk about hypergraphs and atoms of space and branchial time and things in terms of in these mathematical terms. It's another thing to be like, we need to understand observers, because it's probably the case that the way that we are as observers would dictate and actually be responsible for, at least in part, the way in which we perceive physics. Physics isn't just this detached thing that we need to figure out that is objective and beyond us. It's something that is due to us and it is perceived the way that it is by us due to our constraints in nature itself. And that is something that has been very largely kind of intentionally avoided by the mainstream of physics, and that is definitely something that will eventually change, and it seems to have really, really started. I mean, I saw this coming at least like a few years ago, when everybody started coming out with their different fundamental theories, and there was channels popping up everywhere talking about it, including mine being one of them, and I could tell that all of these theories were saying very similar things, or they had models that were kind of like related, even if they were not. They didn't look the same. And if you showed somebody a model of my cosmological verse and a model of Stephen Wolfram's branchial universe, they would probably be like, they have nothing to do with each other. But that's not true at all. I looked at them and I was like, these are just two different ways of modeling essentially the same thing. And I'm sure there's more, but it's just great to see the direction that physics is going. And this interview specifically really reinvigorated my excitement about like the near future, because I mean everybody was very excited for a long time, and then it seemed like everybody put their stuff out there. All of it seems interesting. A lot of it is very much related, but it wasn't. We didn't have a direction to go. It was just like it seemed like a bunch of people with just theories that they were just trying to be the one with the theory that is, accepted as true, and everybody else loses out. But that's not the way that this has to happen. It has to happen in a totally different way, which is that we have to recognize the value and truth of all of these theories that are going to prove out, or not prove out, but be confirmable. And Stephen Wolfram is the one who originally said this, and I think he's dead on. He said that a fundamental theory of metamathematics or metaphysics cannot be proven or falsified. You should be focused on essentially continuous confirmation or confirmability. And that is exactly correct. And I talk about it in my Theories of Everything, the How-To Guide video. But this, you need theories that are like that in order to, that reference each other and can kind of substantiate each other. And that requires an entirely new branch of science, and not just a new branch of science, but a new approach to science. And it's funny that he is the guy who wrote the book, A New Kind of Science, because that is exactly what we need, is a new kind of science in order to get more fundamental than the models that we currently have. And because we need to move to not just describing the way that things are, but we need to get to describing why things are the way that they are, and also why things are why things just are. This is why it's tough. It's because like even the language starts to change when you get down to this fundamental level. And there's like nothing more to say. You're just like, why things are the way they are and why things are. And I said in my Theories of Everything, the How-To Guide video, is that if you want to explain physics, whether that is relativity or quantum mechanics, you have to explain what is responsible for physics. Or if you want to understand physics, you have to understand what is responsible for it. And what I believe, and what it seems now that Stephen Wolfram believes as well, is that what is responsible for physics, the way that we perceive it, is the dimensions and meaning degrees of freedom and constraints of minds, of observers. And so to hear him overtly say that, and I know that a lot of people who are working in this field say that, and a lot of them also don't say it, and it's still in their work. They just don't talk about it because it's seen as, you know, panpsychism or whatever. But it is the direction that we need to go. And I think that the way that Stephen Wolfram puts it is that, you know, he believes that that we perceive the world the way that we do because we are the type of observers that we are. And that is definitely correct. It must be correct. There's no arguing against that. You are observing things and then defining them. You can't detach what's going on in your mind. I don't want to say in your mind because your brain is not your mind. But you cannot detach the dimensions of you and cognition and sentience from the dimensions of whatever it is that you're looking at. Like I said, whether it's colors or space-time or mathematics, PEMDAS, or it is, your senses and your limbs, or everything that you look at is going to be emergent from the constraints and degrees of freedom of cognition itself, of an observer itself, of perception itself. And so that's probably why we keep coming back to 4, being a primary number in every major model that we have of, 4D space-time and inside-outside sensing and acting and inside-outside separate and oneness. There's something here that is has to do with how an observer is. So it's awesome to see this, but here we go. So this is Karl Friston talking about how the free energy principle is essentially gets into the physics of sentience, he calls it, which is just a great way of describing it.
The physics, or the move which makes the physics that is described by the free energy principle distinct from the usual applications of the mathematical formulation, is that you've got a distinction between the states of an observer and that which is observed, which now allows it or licenses you to interpret the observing states as holding beliefs about the observed states. So under what we would normally call a sort of Markov blanket partition, where you're partitioning the all possible states into the states of the thing doing the observation and the external states being observed. What you're saying is that the internal states now play the role of the sufficient statistics of beliefs or distributions about the external states. So these are beliefs about something. They're not the probability distribution of the thing itself, which is what you would apply, or how you deploy the principle least action in the usual sense. But it's exactly the same maths, but now applied to the conditional distributions or the Bayesian beliefs encoded by or entailed by the internal states. So this is where the physics of sentience comes in, and you can start to talk about being surprised, in an anthropomorphic sense. But the maths is there's nothing new in the maths. It's just what inherits from being able to distinguish between the inside and the outside. Does that make sense? So
Fascinating. I mean, I could speak about what they're talking about for days, as anybody who follows this knows, but I don't even know what to say specifically about it if I'm not going to go on for days. But it's just amazing to see this. It's very cool. Yeah, this is but I will say this. This is what I will say if I'm going to sum this up. Physics, at least what we think of as relativity, which is space-time, the 3 dimensions of space plus time, and also quantum mechanics, is the physics of sentience. There isn't an additional physics of sentience that is below that physics. That physics is the physics of sentience. This is what's kind of tough about physics right now, and why physics has kind of stalled, is because historically we've had Newtonian physics, which is it's kind of just a bit different and than quantum mechanics, obviously, and it doesn't mean that it's not able to be manipulated and used to cause force, just like Newtonian physics, but it's almost metaphysics. Quantum mechanics, it's almost a different field from what is traditionally considered physics when it comes to thermodynamics and inertia and things like that. I mean, all of that is very different than quantum mechanics, and it's also very different than general relativity as well, or relativistic physics, which is also almost metaphysics. And these two, relativity and quantum mechanics, these two perspectives on physics that people are trying to link it's interesting that they're trying to link those specifically because they're described so differently and incorrectly. When people say relativity is the physics of the very large and quantum mechanics is the physics of the very small, that's not actually true at all. But there's a much better way to describe it, and I'm not exactly sure if I'm going to do the best job at doing that right now. But they're both almost metaphysics. They're not as much physics as Newtonian physics would be, or what I would just am calling Newtonian physics. I don't know exactly what is the best way to describe these in the academic sense, but I think you get what I'm saying, is that there's kind of the physics of things, and then there's the physics of beings, and the issue is that we don't realize yet that general relativity or relativistic physics and also quantum mechanics and the Standard Model are both the physics of beings, not the physics of things. They can be integrated into the physics of things, but they themselves are not actually the physics of things. They are the physics of beings. I guess I did figure out a way to describe the difference between them. I think that's actually pretty good. Is that Newtonian physics, like I said, inertia and I don't know, thermodynamics and things like that. That's all the physics of things. But the physics of beings is on the quantum level and on the gravitational level, essentially, like which is, I guess better to just be usually associated with relativistic physics, I guess you could call it general relativity. I don't know exactly the best academic terms to use. But I think, like I said, you get the idea. But it is interesting that there's just this weird place that physics has arrived where it seems like it's three different fields, which, by the way, this follows sentient singularity theories models that show that, of this binary triality model, which is that there's generationality appears in a triadic fashion, but really there's only 2 degrees of freedom, which is the same. It's like seeing you see this in space-time as well. So you can look at time and you could say there's the future and there's the past and there's the present, and that looks like 3, but really it's 2 degrees of freedom plus 1 intrinsic constraint, which the intrinsic constraint is the present. You can't escape it. You're always in the present. But the 2 degrees of freedom are the future and past. But same thing goes with space as well, but we think about it as length with height. But that's really like a secondary perspective that comes from a primary perspective of space, of spatial maneuvering, which is forwards towards a goal, backwards away from a goal, and always being also in your current location in relationship with your goal. And so I don't even know if it's the right way to describe it as a spatial. It's like protospatial, 3D protospace, essentially. And it's the maneuverable, it's the dimensions of maneuverability, of physical maneuverability. That's what it is. But it's from the perspective of an observer. If you noticed, it's within the context of a goal. And so it's the problem is that when you separate this stuff from an observer and you don't think about this as coming from an observer, then you just think that there's 3 dimensions to space, length, width, and height, and we don't know where they come from, but they're there. No, they are coming from this triality of dimensionality, this trialic aspect of dimensions of cognition and of information processing and hierarchization. And then there's also always this 2 degrees of freedom that is kind of hidden within that. So you can see that within space and within time, or at least within time and within proto-space, you could call it. But when you're talking about time, you're already talking about it from the perspective of an observer. When you say the future for who? The future for you. That's the future that we're talking about. The past for who? The past for you. That's the past that we're talking about. The present for who? The present for you. So, but when we think about length, width, and height, length for who? Width for who? Like height for who? Like this is, it doesn't really make sense anymore. And it's because we are just of our position within the hierarchy of beingness that is existence itself. It means that time is intrinsically going to be perceived by us as something that we exist in, but not necessarily something that is like a maneuverable space. I'm not saying that we can't figure that one out. I don't know, but whereas we are intended, our degrees of freedom are actually within spatial maneuvering, I guess, and so we perceive it differently than we perceive time. But if you understand where that comes from, then you'll see it the same exact way, which they get into in this specifically is about space and an observer feeling like they're in a fixed position in space, but that's actually not true according to everything that we know about physics, essentially. And but it appears to be true to you, and you have to understand that that's because it's your perception of location is dependent on where things are compared to you. So you are always in your current location, and therefore when you are looking at the world around you, you are perceiving it as regards to you. And so it looks like you're fixed, essentially, because it must look like you are fixed to yourself, because that you yourself is your consistent reference point by which you use to, orient in everything, internally and externally. So they're going to get way into this. So here. This is them talking about exactly what kind of we're talking about right now.
Implicit, perhaps, assumptions of observers like us is that we think we're at a fixed place in space. I was kind of realizing that that's sort of why Copernicus was so shocking, so to speak, because, we really did believe we were at a fixed place in space, because that is our experience. And yet, if the Earth's going around the sun, that can't really be what's actually happening in some sense. But I think, so what I'm trying to understand is, in your sort of view of kind of characteristics of observers, I think you're describing sort of a more nuanced version of what an observer like us has to be like. And this kind of seeking of predictability it's an interesting idea. I mean, it's and the question would be, to what extent in this kind of, unruly Ruliad, so to speak, of all possible computations, that we are seeking the predictable paths, or the predictable, sort of seeking predictability in that, is sort of an interesting principle. And I suppose I'm curious, if you look at it from the point of view of, well, I think, as you say, it's a little bit tautological, because, without predictability, if things are sufficiently unpredictable, you don't get to coherently exist. If things are sufficiently unpredictable, you will be torn apart by those outside forces that you cannot control, so to speak. I am curious, when it comes to things like control theory, and, the...
Okay, so kind of what I was kind of getting at is that we cannot detach the observer from physics if physics is going to be relativity and also quantum mechanics. Like, we are an intrinsic component, not even the component of this. We are more than a component of this. We are partially responsible for this. And if, sentient singularity theory is correct, we are within a mind. We're made of cells which are minds within our mind, which is our beingness, and we are essentially cells in a larger mind, and that fundamentally there is nothing but minds, and that are being partitioned from an initial singular mind, or singular sentient being, sentient singularity. And so it's just a fascinating conversation. There's so much to say about every clip of this, but what he referenced there is the Ruliad in his work, and I have a prediction Ruliad. So he says, the Ruliad builds on a tower of ideas that includes the computational paradigm, the exploration of the computational universe of simple programs, the principle of computational equivalence, the Wolfram Physics Project, and the multi-computational paradigm. That doesn't tell me what it is. Okay, here we go. The Ruliad. The concept of the Ruliad, the entangled limit of everything. I call it the Ruliad. Think of it as an entangled limit of everything that is computationally possible. The result of following all possible computational rules in all possible ways. It's yet another surprising construct that's arisen from the physics project. Extremely deep implications both in science and beyond. Okay? In many ways, the Ruliad is a strange and profoundly abstract thing, but it's something very universal, a kind of ultimate limit of all abstraction and generalization. It encapsulates not only formal possibilities, but also everything about our physical universe, and everything we experience can be thought of as sampling a part of the Ruliad that corresponds to our particular way of perceiving and interpreting the universe. And by the way, look at that. And that looks a lot like my cosmological verse model, which you can see on sentientsingularity.com, but you can also see it here. It's just different because he is using lines essentially like this would be a point, and then a line would go to this point, and then a line would go to this point, and a line would go to this point. But me, I'm using cells that are connected via functions essentially. And but they are all connected, and so to prove that, if I put in a 0 here, and all of a sudden everything changes to 0 completely in these consecutive nested cosmological verses, but if I put in a 1, everything fills in with these quantities according to the functions that are occurring, and this model is built on another model that I have of cognition itself. And then that's built on these 4 primary perspectives. Inside, outside, separate, and oneness, which are all defining of each other. Outside is separate from oneness. Inside is separate and oneness. Separate is inside or outside of oneness. Oneness is outside and inside of separateness. So they are all co-defining. But this, my hunch here, by the way, is... But yeah, I see this, and I recognize. Coming from 1, you get to 4, and then so on. What is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's exactly what my model would show as well. My model literally goes 1, 4, 9. I'm not exaggerating or at all. You have a sentient singularity. Don't pay attention to this. This is kind of more metaphorical than anything else. It's really more like, it's kind of that, but it's the Ruliad. And there are 4 primary perspectives to every sentient being, every mind, which this being, this initial sentience is, which is sentient existence. And from these 4, you get to this model, which is 9 right here. And then from this 9 dimensional model, which is computational as well, like you can tell here, and I'll explain all this in my video on sentient singularity theory specifically. But then from that model, you build this model, and then from that model, you build the consecutive, infinitely nested model of this. And so, what is that's fascinating, though, that just shows that in his work. I'm not saying I understand exactly what's going on. What's the next one? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. That makes perfect sense, is that it would be 16. So, and all of that does line up with quantum physics and relativistic physics as well. I mean, this model that he has here, this multi-weight graph. But I think Wolfram's work is I've always said this, and is that Wolfram's work, even though I don't follow it very much, I see so much overlap with mine, and that's part of why I haven't followed it that closely. I've listened to his interviews, but I don't watch his own channel, and I know he does like a lot of live streams and stuff like that, kind of teaching hours and things like that. But I've kind of tried to just work independently, but I've always seen like a lot of similarity there. But what I will say though is that when he's talking about, this Ruliad has implications about science and beyond, my prediction is that this Ruliad is God. It's what I would call God, which is it is existence itself as a singular sentient being, an eternal singular sentient being that is just inevitable because of the coherence of information and the definition of existence being a single kind of enclosed system, because anything outside it would be non-existence, which means it doesn't exist. So, and there's information in it, and information within an enclosed system is totally referenced. It must completely reference itself, which if there is a information system that completely references itself, that means it's completely self-aware, and that implies sentience. I mean, self-aware is sentience. So, but it is the structure of existence that has with it, because it is a singular existence, this singularity, this singularness, this oneness of this initial sentience, of this initial condition of existence, leads to extraordinary constraints when it comes to kind of how to build a universe. And but there are degrees of freedom within those constraints as well. And so when Wolfram's saying it's the entangled limit of everything that is computationally possible, I would say that that's true, but there's more to it. It's like the entangled limit of everything that is perceptually possible as well. And which is kind of the step below computation is perception. And they're kind of similar-ish, but they're not exactly the same. Perception is more fundamental, and it has to do with orientation within symmetry structures, and which is the organization of information into a symmetry structure first, and then information is computed through that symmetry structure that has been created. But there is a symmetry structure that organizes initially all information and orients all information prior to computation taking place. And so it's the limit of everything that's computationally possible, yes, but it is also the limit of everything that is perceptually possible more fundamentally. And it is the entangled mass of sentient beings. And so if you go to sentientsingularity.com and you go to writings and you go to technical description of existence and you look at the abstract to the paper that's I am working on still, you'll see that sentient singularity theory describes the totality of existence as a singularity of sentience that is creating additional sentient singularities within itself. And this totality of existence as a singularity of sentience that is creating additional sentient singularities within itself, that thing is a being, and that being is the Ruliad. It's the rule maker. It's also the one that is, there are rules that even God has to follow, but that come from the constraints that emerge from the very oneness of existence itself, and also the very nature of the oneness that is existence, which is sentience. So there are constraints that come from that lead to the universe that we have. And it's interesting that he uses this term Ruliad, and I really do like the term, but it's going to eventually probably be God. Like it is God. I believe that it is God that he's talking about. It might be the kind of like the body of God in a way, that you're talking about it as more of a thing, which is like to say I'm a human, but I'm a being. I'm a human being. Well, there's existence, and there is sentient existence, which is God, essentially. The singularity of sentience that is existence. So there is a nature, and there is a structure to every one. There's a structure to everything. There's a structure and a nature to every one, and that nature is always sentience, and that structure is, it depends on the level of that being. So, but it always is at the essentially, when you boil it down, the structure of oneness. I am, meaning I as one being, even me, even though I'm made of cells that are also beings, and the Ruliad is a sentient being, which is God, that is also, I don't know if you could say made of, because it exists prior to, though the God partitions sentience within himself, and so the assembly that he is built out of, or the assembly that is growing within him, is not that which he is built out of, because he pre-existed multiplicity of sentience, there was singularity of sentience prior to multiplicity of sentience, and there was always singularity of sentience. And so we have some of this nature as well, where there is oneness to us. You know, you can't cut me in half and still have me. Like, I am one being, and I am also an assembly of beings. God is that too, but we are, you could say, we are built of an assembly of beings, or we are stacked. My sentience is stacked on an assembly of sentient beings, which would be my cells. God's sentience is not stacked on an assembly of sentient beings, or constructed of those sentient beings. He constructs those sentient beings within himself and pre-exists them. And this is the Ruliad. It's inevitable, but I am waiting to hear Stephen Wolfram describe it more overtly. But if he ever says, this is what I predict, and we'll see, and this would be my question for him, is the Ruliad an observer? That's my question. Because if so, been saying it. And that would be awesome. So if I ever talk to Stephen Wolfram, that's what I'm going to ask him. Is the Ruliad an observer? And if he's ever said it and you know it, comment it in the chat. Let me see if anybody's here. But yeah, there's a lot of people watching, but not any questions. But if you have any, let me know. So that would, if anybody ever talks to Stephen Wolfram, ask him if the Ruliad is an observer and let me know what he says. But this is the next clip. This is about Markov blankets being
implicit, perhaps, assumptions of observers like us is that we think we're at a fixed place in space. I was kind of realizing that that's sort of why Copernicus was so shocking, so to speak, because we really did believe we were at a fixed place in space, because that is our experience. And yet, if the Earth's going around the sun, that can't really be what's actually happening in some sense. But I think, so what I'm trying to understand is, in your sort of view of kind of characteristics of observers, I think you're describing sort of a more nuanced version of what an observer like us has to be like. And this kind of seeking of predictability it's an interesting idea. I mean, it's and the question would be, to what extent in this kind of, unruly Ruliad, so to speak, of all possible computations, that we are seeking the predictable paths, or the predictable, sort of seeking predictability in that, is sort of an interesting principle. I mean, I suppose I'm curious, if you look at it from the point of view of, well, I think, as you say, it's a little bit tautological, because, without predictability, if things are sufficiently unpredictable, you don't get to coherently exist. If things are sufficiently unpredictable, you will be torn apart by those outside forces that you cannot control, so to speak. I am curious, when it comes to things like control theory, and the whole sort of idea of, I mean, control theory is a much more limited way of thinking about what can you control. But I'm sort of curious in, I mean, if I were to try to, let's say my environment was how unpredictable an environment can I be in and still achieve enough control to be your kind of observer? I guess I would be curious if there's a characterization of just how unruly can the world be and still allow a coherent observer of the kind that you're imagining.
That's a challenging question. A superficial answer was not that unruly. There has to be something recognizable as time proceeds. Can I just say, you brought so many wonderful issues to the table there, all of which I can see through the lens of my understanding of much simpler classical physics that underwrites the free energy principle. Just very briefly, these two fundaments that you mentioned, the notion of computational boundedness plus persistence in time, underwriting thingness, and in particular the capacity to just observe or be an observer. For me, that is immediately reflected in the two pillars of the free energy principle, which is, first of all, a Markov boundary, which is the thing that demarcates the observer from the observed. So I know that you were using bounded in a your sort of bounded rationality, possibly,
Different
or
sense,
different sense. But I still think it's quite beautiful that in fact the whole FEP can just be written down from the statement: there exists a Markov boundary that separates the inside of a thing from the outside of a thing. And if you
can I pick up on that for a second, because I'm really curious about to me, for example, our sensory organs are presumably there's a brain inside, but it's connected only by certain sort of thin sensory organs to the outside world. And I guess that I'm curious, because to me, what our sensors and our measuring devices typically do is they take a large number of possible things that might be happening in the world, they equivalence a lot of those together, so we just get to say, I see a cat, even though the details of the pixels in that cat might be very different. And I'm sort of curious, to the extent that you talk about this kind of Markov boundary, Markov blanket idea, to what extent is the sparsification of external stimuli for that same reason? That is, that it seems like measuring devices or our sensors, whatever, their big purpose is take all these different possible states of the world and equivalence lots of them together so that we can just make a simple summary. Is that consistent with your kind of view of how you get that sparsity of connection between the outside and the inside, so to speak? Or do you have a different point of view about that?
No, I have exactly that point of view, and I'd even go further. All the internal.
Okay, so basically, this ended up being kind of a longer clip than I was expecting. But to summarize where it goes, and that's interesting, is the host of the show. I'm sorry, but I do not know his name. But it's on. I'm sure it's on the channel. If you want to watch their stream, click the link below. I've included it. But they get into a discussion of how much information and what information is being focused on by a being, essentially, by a mind, not a brain. We really need to stop using the term brain, because a brain is a thing that we observe inside of the thing that is the human body. But it is not you, and it is not actually the thing that is interpreting information. It is essentially the physically observed, the physical observation of the entangled connection points of different aspects of your beingness. But it is just like your eyes are the physically observed structure that is responsible for the sense of sight. But your brain is the physical structure that is observed as responsible for the entanglement of these different aspects of your beingness and of your information processing. But it is not the information processor. The information processor is you. And not just you, but the world that you observe around you as well. I talk about this all the time. When Jordan Peterson says clean your room, and everybody talked about how great of an idea that was for so long, and it seems obvious though, but it is true. The best, the most important things are actually usually obvious. But every time before these streams, and I say this again and again, I organize my desk and the room around me, because I'm trying to have as coherent thoughts as I can, and this is part of my thinking space, and it's part of my information processing space, and it's this and this, all of what, meaning that's not even the right way to put it, because now we're talking about a body again. Everything that I experience as being internal and perceived internally, and everything that I experience as being perceived externally, is part of my information processing, and it's not going on in the brain. So brain is just a connection point, or it's it's like an entanglement point, but it's not actually you are a mind. You are not a brain. And to take your brain out and put it into another body, if we ever got to the point where we could do a brain transplant, you would not, I predict that you would not see the same, the person that you took the brain from. You would, let's just say, thought experiment here. This is like, I guess this would be like my version of Schrodinger's cat, but I mean, not exactly. But this is to my thought experiment to convey a very fundamental idea about the relationship between the fundamentality of sentience and the emergence of space. It is currently the assumption, I would think, in neuroscience and probably physics and biology and many other traditional mainstream scientific narratives, that if you had two people and you took the brain out of one and put it into a different body, that new body would be, a little bit changed, but also really mostly the person that you took the brain from. I do not predict that would be the case, actually. I bet I'm not saying that we can do this, because I don't know if we could, and I'm not going to hold my breath for us to be able to do this, but just theoretically, if you could do that, my prediction is that you would actually get the person that had the body that you put the brain into, not the person that you took the brain from. So just like when you take a heart from someone who dies and you put it into someone else, you do a heart transplant, you don't get the person who you took the heart from in this different body that you put the heart into. You get the original person that you put the heart into. I bet you that this would be the exact same, or maybe not the exact same, but it would be much closer to that with a brain transplant than it would be to this idea of like, you are a brain in a jar. You're not a brain in the jar. You are a mind. You have a brain. You are a mind. You have a heart. You are a mind. You have a stomach, but, or you are a mind. You have a body. That body includes a stomach and a brain and a heart. But none of these are equivalent to you. They are the physically perceived structures of information processing of your being. And that's actually a profound idea. And it is I think is very different than our current, assumptions in mainstream science. But I've actually never heard anybody even necessarily like put it exactly like that. I can't be the first one though, because it seems like that's such an obvious thought experiment, is like, if you have two bodies and two people essentially, and you took the brain out of one and you put the brain of another into that body, who is now there? Is it the person you took the brain from, or is it the person whose body you put it into? I bet you it would be the person whose body it was. But that's fascinating though, because it brings up the whole philosophical question of the ship that, every time you replace like a bolt on it and this piece of wood and that piece of wood, and eventually is it the same ship? At what point would you no longer be able to do that when it comes to organs? Maybe it is the brain, but you wouldn't be able to transfer the consciousness. You just, my prediction is that if you couldn't give somebody a new brain and them not come back to life, but like, come out of the surgery. Let's say they had a brain injury. What if you did a brain transplant? Maybe they would come back, but they would have a much higher IQ, but they actually wouldn't be a different person. They would be different, but they would be the same sentience. Or you just wouldn't be able to do it, and you just couldn't transfer brains, and if somebody lost their brain, then that's it, they're dead. And there's no way to bring them back. That's probably my prediction, but theoretically speaking, if we're just going to use this as an example of to showcase the relationship of sentience to of mind and matter, in theory, you would get the same being whose body you put the brain into. But I don't necessarily think it's possible, because the brain does seem to be a little different in that it is not that it's more directly linked to necessarily who you are as a someone, but it is kind of responsible for so many systems at once that it might not be possible to disconnect it from those systems and not destroy the existence of you as a being in and being alive, essentially. Not that your sentience wouldn't go on, but like it wouldn't go on in space-time, it would just, heavens. But but theoretically it would. I don't think that the idea of putting a brain from one body into the other, and then that being is now the same being that you took the brain from, that does not make sense. So, not exactly sure how we got on that, but here. Oh, okay. So yeah, they were talking in this about kind of information processing, and I'm probably not going to show the clip, but they do talk. They discuss about how the presenter says that the free energy principle is. You know what? Actually, I'm just going to show it because I know what they're going to say, but I actually think it's important.
Levels,
well, that's what I wanted to ask about, is because this is a connection that I've been thinking about to the being computationally bound. Is that if you're a computationally bound observer, you necessarily must compress, even if your sensory organs could perceive every particle within your light cone, it still wouldn't do you any good because you don't have the computational capacity to compute. Right? You to compute all that, you only have a finite amount. So therefore, you almost necessarily have to do something like the free energy principle, because you've got to compress, which implies uncertainty and inaccuracy, and therefore you need to balance out how accurate can I be with the amount of computation that I can do, with my resources.
But so there's a little bit of a difference here, because you could imagine something where there's lots of randomness, which you just ignore for purposes of your sensory input. But I think what's being said about this free energy principle is that you're doing more than just ignoring it. You are actively trying to lead your life so as to minimize it, which is a different thing. I mean, you could say, we're going to observe, there's something happening in, I don't know, we're exposed to a cloud, let's say. We're exposed to all kinds of turbulence in the air. And we could say, we're perfectly happy. We're exposed to that, but the only thing we're going to pay attention to is something about how, light travels through the air or something. But you're saying that, no, actually, our way of leading our lives, consistent with our continued existence, so to speak, is avoid that turbulence. Go and fly through sort of unturbulent, still air, so to speak, so that we avoid the places where we are going to be challenged by not knowing what's going to happen. So I think you're going beyond just saying we sort of throw away information. You're saying we actively seek to build a world, or to organize ourselves to live in a world where things are as predictable as possible. And as we were saying, I mean, there might come a time when sort of things become deeply unpredictable, and where there isn't. And I assume that I don't know whether this is included in your model, but if suddenly something very different happened, if suddenly the Earth went near a black hole or something, and all kinds of crazy things started happening, and we don't know what's going on, there's presumably even the process of figuring out what should we do is one that could take us a while. And I don't know whether that's accounted for in your kind of model of things. I mean, to say we go to the thing that minimizes our surprise, maximizes our predictability, there could be a non-equilibrium phase in which we don't even know. It's very hard for us to work out what will be the most predictable path, so to speak.
Radical uncertainty, if you're an economist. Yeah, absolutely. You're bringing, again, so many issues for it's difficult to know what to pick up on.
I'm sorry. You're getting me to think. This is you're getting me to do this.
So that's exactly right, though. I want to just say that's exactly right. It's not that there's so much information out there, and your mind must minimize it in order to actually process it. That's not what is really how your mind processes information. There is, due to your own oneness, and that means you're having oneness of will, which means having oneness of goal, means that you all of this leads to you having specific constraints placed on how you observe things that leads to you having the necessitation of focus, essentially. So you must focus in order to actually perceive it in any kind of orientable way. And that focus is it's not actively throwing out a bunch of information that you just can't process. It's that you can only focus on one thing at a time, and that and there are also specific degrees of freedom and constraints or dimensions to cognition itself that specifically lead to a limit of information that is being processed at any given time. But it's not due to your computational limit necessarily. It's that there's the active process of perception and orientation, which is, I guess, even more so in perception, is like active perception is like orientation, necessitates focus, which intrinsically cuts out everything that is not what you're focused on. But it's not that you're trying to cut it out. It's that you must focus on you must focus, essentially, is just the point I'm making. You must focus. It is part of cognition, and it's part of orientation, which is part of cognition. So I think it was a good way that Stephen Wolfram kind of explained how the host was kind of incorrect in what he was saying, but I get why he was saying that. But that is kind of a relevant concept to other aspects of us, which is more in line with I guess you could say other aspects of cognition, which would be like IQ, like processing information. But that's more about speed, I feel like, than anything else. But speed is about it's like horsepower, but you can just break it down. If you don't have as much horsepower, you just go slower, and then you'll still get there. It's the same thing as Ferrari versus a golf cart. They'll still both get you there. It's just one will get you there faster than the other. But it's not that neither one will get you there. What is responsible for getting you there is this other aspect of cognition that is much more fundamental, which is what Stephen Wolfram is talking about, which is more so, which is kind of that he described it as actively avoiding noise, essentially, instead of kind of throwing out information. It's like you're trying to maximize predictability, but it's that maximizing predictability is the fundamental action, and the emergent action, or the result of it is the minimization of noise. But it's not, you can't just actively seek to avoid noise. It won't get you anywhere, because you can only actually process information, think about anything, do anything by doing it, not by avoiding doing something, essentially. So if it has like even moral implications. It's like, when you're thinking about morality, the most important thing to focus on is doing good, not just not doing bad. Because like all you did was never do anything bad, but you never did anything good, then it's like that's not a way of, you can't be by doing that. You literally cannot. You will fall away, and entropy will just destroy you. But you have to focus on doing good. So there is like this active process that's going on of seeking specific information due to specific goals, and and orienting along that journey, by in a way that, if it's done properly, will emergently minimize surprise, but will kind of more fundamentally maximize predictability, I guess. It's just, I don't know if I did a great job explaining that. So, this is them talking about agential observers.
Formulation of efficient communication in terms of minimum message length and minimum description length formulations, the kind of universal computation you get to from Kolmogorov complexity. All of this is about making sense of stuff from the outside coming in. But of course, when you're moving, exactly as you say, you've now got the opportunity to decide what sensory information to go and gather, or you can change your perceived or modelled external states in order to deliver different kinds of information. And I think that's the twist. That's what makes an observer an observer, as opposed to just a sessile object or a passive thing that is not able to actually change the course, can act back upon. Use the word feedback. I think that's absolutely crucial. So there's a circular causality here. There's certain kinds of things. So an observer, I think, a true agential observer, has the capacity to act upon the thing that's generating the data. And it is in that acting that you get the curiosity. And as you say, ignoring and in fact actively avoiding that noisy, ambiguous, potentially boundary destroying, dissipative part of the universe, and sticking to those paths. But in sticking to those paths, because you can't see the paths as they unfold deep into the universe, all you have are the sensory impressions that are local to your local interactions on your measurement tools or your sensory receptors. So you actually have to have a model of what might be going on and where the path might be leading in order. And of course, that's where this resolution of uncertainty, the curiosity comes in, that you're taking all the local cues to build a model of where you think the path might be, so that you can follow the path. So to come right back to your final thing, what happens if we went too close to a black hole?
Okay, so exactly, but I would say that I agree with everything that he said. Essentially, is that an observer versus a passive thing, it has the ability to act, which instead of just react or be acted on, it has the ability to act itself. And so, we have things that we have like ChatGPT. It is able to react, and but a water bottle cannot react. It just is acted on. But then there is ChatGPT, which is acted on and has the ability to react, but it doesn't have the ability to act. Whereas, and a water bottle has no ability to act. This can be acted on. ChatGPT can be acted on, and it has the ability to react. And, but then there's an observer, which they call it in this, which I call it's just a sentient being. That's what it is. In my framework of sentient singularity theory, in the part of the paper that I was recently working on, it specifically is outlining the differentiation between things and beings. There are things and there are beings, and things are perceptions of beings, and so things can be the perceived representations of a being, but they're not actually a being. So you can look at me, and we say, look at me, but what you're really looking at is my body, and you are kind of looking at me, but you're not really looking at me. You can't see me. If I'm dead and I'm, just laying on the ground, or versus I am just laying on the ground with my eyes closed, you don't know if which state I'm in. You don't know if I'm dead and no longer there and it's just my body, or if I am alive and it's just me laying down with my eyes closed. And so that's what I mean by you can't see me. I could be gone and you don't know. You see a representation of a physical projection of me, but you don't see me, and I don't see you in the physical sense. I cannot visually see you, and you cannot visually see me. You just see a projection of me, and I just see a projection of you, but we don't actually see each other. And it's interesting. I think doesn't Namaste mean something like the light in me recognizes the light in you or something. The consciousness in me recognizes the consciousness in you. Essentially, that would be what that means. Something means that. It might not be namaste, but I thought it was. And I think it is. And that's what I'm talking about, is like, you can see that to some degree, but you can't do that just visually. Like, you have to, there's like a metaphysical way that I think we see that, but or we feel it. We feel it's a better way of saying, the sentience in me feels the sentience that is you. Or the sentience that is me feels the sentience that is you, is even more accurate than the sentience in me sees the sentience in you or something. Because you are that sentience. There isn't sentience in you. There isn't light in you. You are light, if light means consciousness, which I think it is implied to be. But so the sentience that is me recognizes the sentience that is you, would be like more technical way of stating that. But yeah, but when he says that you're trying to kind of minimize surprise, you're not trying to minimize surprise. Trying to minimize surprise is going to get you nowhere. Trying to maximize predictability will get you somewhere. But it comes from like goals. It's only always within the context of a goal. And so, but when he's talking about things versus, he's saying observers versus inanimate things, essentially. Beings have things, I have a body, but I am not my body. So it's not even right to say a being's body has a sentience. That's not even quite correct, and that this doesn't have a sentience. We need a different framework. We need a new kind of science to even discuss this stuff. So they get into a discussion of agency on this, and I'll show the clip of what agency means. And agency could mean one of two. Could mean this, or it could mean that. There are two degrees of freedom always, and you could pick one or the other, but you just have to be consistent. So agency could mean you are able to react, or agency means that you must have the ability to act. And it just depends on how you're describing, how you're defining it. But there are kind of three ways of there appears to be three types of states of information and one of them is an inanimate thing like a water bottle that you can act on, but it cannot react and it cannot act, but it can be acted on, versus ChatGPT or these reactive algorithms, which is they cannot act, but they can react, and they can be acted on. And then there's beings, sentient beings, with like observers, as they call them, which like you and me, who can be acted on and can react and can act. And so while this appears to be a triality of dimensions, it's actually 2 degrees of freedom, really. There's that are hidden in here. One of them is that there is a sentient being that is able to act, and there is also 2 things that are truly actually inanimate, and one of them appears like it's able to act, but it's really just reacting, which is ChatGPT. And so the inclination might be, because it's able to react, to give it some type of classification onto itself that makes it more of an agent than you and me, but less of an agent than a water bottle. But the thing is that that's actually false, because and it doesn't actually have any agency. It just has been set up to appear like it is able to react, but it's not even. But reacting is just really just being acted on still. So if you left ChatGPT alone and and nobody asked it any questions, nobody messed with its code anymore, nobody did anything, we just sat and watched it, nothing would happen. It would be the same exact thing as if you sat and just watched this water bottle. Exactly the same. You could put this water bottle on this is another way of showcasing the obviousness of this. Let's say I put this water bottle on top of an RC car, and I put little sensors on the RC car so that... No, let's just talk about a Roomba. Let's just talk about a Roomba. A Roomba is able to react, right? But it's not... It's the same exact thing as ChatGPT. It's just less complicated in its programming, probably, but it is the same exact type of thing where it hits a wall and it moves, and it's been pre-programmed in how it's going to react when it hits a wall. But it's still actually just a thing that is completely absent to agency, just like a water bottle. I was going to say it has the same level of agency. It has no level of agency. It just appears to, whereas you have agency. So, you have the ability to act. And so here's my issue with using agency to describe things like ChatGPT is you could use it that way, but it almost destroys the purpose of it, because if you because you're really just using it to describe an inanimate object that sometimes is able to react in certain environments, I guess. But it's all of that has been set up by a sentient being. You built the Roomba. You made ChatGPT. It never existed on its own, which means it's not even a thing that can manifest really like in and of itself, and it has no ability to act on its own, is what I'm getting at. I know I kind of went on about it, but it's tough to describe this stuff because what is agency? And it's like the reality is it could be something that reacts but is not able to actually make any observations, and is actually it's just a thing, just like a water bottle, but it just kind of, in our perception of it, is a little bit more. It's just reactive, I guess. I don't know the right way to. We don't have the right linguistic frameworks for this, but it's not. It's not like it's a step towards agents or sentience or observerness. It's not. It looks like it is, but it's not. It's like Eric Weinstein says that there's an imposter in his geometric unity model of the triality. In the standard model is like, he said, it's actually two generations, but one of them is an imposter. That makes sense, at least, because there's always really 2 degrees of freedom plus an intrinsic constraint, which is like it's like a pseudo degree of freedom, but it's not. It's that there are 3 dimensions, but only 2 of them are degrees of freedom, and one of them is a constraint. So I remember. People talk about, physicists will say, what is a dimension? It's a degree of freedom. It's a degree of freedom or a constraint. And they're kind of one and the same from different perspectives. There's like, is a hallway a degree of freedom for you to walk down, or is it like a constraint because it's these walls around it are a constraint? Well, it's both. The walls that are the constraint that is the hallway is also responsible for the creation of the degree of freedom. So It's a bit tough, but this pattern occurs everywhere. That's why I'm talking about it. It occurs in the standard model. It occurs in colors and math and even in the perception of agency. So, water bottle, Roomba, human. It's like, no, really, water bottle and Roomba are in the same category. Maybe not in perception, but in their internal perception, they are. But because they have no internal perception, this is the best way to put it. I figured it out. Roomba and a water bottle are in the same category because internally they have the same nature. There is no self-perception that either one of them has. In fact, there is no perception at all that any one of them has. There is an illusion of perception that one of them has, but it is an illusion. Whereas us, we have self-perception and perception beyond, because there is only there's beings that perceive and things that do not, and so there isn't a difference between self-perception and perception outside of self. You must perceive self in order to have any perception. It is the initiality of perception itself. You could say it's the foundation of all perception is self-perception. But I hope that made a little bit of sense. I had to kind of figure it out. But yeah, I mean, I guess you could use agency in that way that is describing ChatGPT or whatever, but it's not. Then it just means that you can that a structure is able to react if ChatGPT is an agent. But next clip. This is them talking about what is a thing. They're talking about thinginess versus observerness, which is in sentient singularity theory is things and beings. It's a much simpler way of describing it, but I understand that it's a process. But thinginess it's just a thing. There are things, there are beings.
Explore this versus that. It's not a question of just the vortex is moving through the fluid and the laws of motion make it do this or that thing. I mean, and I think this is so you're attributing to the thing that you are treating as an observer some degree of possibility of choice. And although maybe not, maybe you're saying that your free energy principle is essentially the deterministic physics of what has to happen, and even though the observer may feel that they have a choice, they really ultimately have no choice, because they're really being led by the nose, so to speak, by this free energy principle to do what they do. And even though they might imagine that they could do something different, they necessarily won't do something different. I mean, I'm curious what you see as being, I mean, does your notion of, I mean, are you saying that, okay, so one point of view would be that what you're describing is kind of a law of motion for an observer, and that law of motion, despite the observer feeling that they can choose to do this or that, they really can't, any more than an object moving inertially through space can choose to do this or that. So like for example, you've got a spacecraft and it's got all kinds of critters inside it, and they're running around and they're saying, we got to do this and that and the other. But their spacecraft, without any propulsion system, is just going to keep going in this inertial trajectory. Whatever they might, they might run around and have all kinds of enthusiasm for things it might do, but it's not going to do them any good. And so you might take the point of view that it's the same thing with our brains. And I'm curious whether you do take that point of view.
Well, I love that analogy of the spacecraft with lots of intelligent sentient critters but can't actually control where they're going. Again, you've picked up, I think, on some key points there. So I would say that to be an observer is to have the kind of agency that you're implying by the choosing or selecting certain actions to commit to, actions on the world that will elicit or solicit different kinds of measurements that you can then use to make sense of your model of how the world works and your place and the way that you couple to that world. So I agree absolutely entirely that there is a bright line between this being a thing, being that vortex or soliton or something that just persists, and having the kind of agency that allows you to plan and to make moves. And I think planning, although it's perhaps a very intuitive way of describing it, actually captures the notion that you actually spoke to, which is having a choice means that you have counterfactual beliefs in your model about the consequences of your action. I think that's quite crucial. I think that introduces another bright line between different kinds of things. So there are things that just don't act. There's things possibly like the vortex or a stone, things that can't couple back and change their environment, and then there are things that can move back and change their environment. And you could argue this massive bodies might fall into this category by exerting gravitational forces. Just open brackets, I agree with you entirely. Things like space and time, these are fantasies, are hypotheses that only come from this coarse-grained observation of the world. But I think the key line between the kind of observer that you and I are and the kind of observations that, say, a thermostat would do is exactly what you're talking about. It's imagining counterfactual futures, and very simply articulated mathematically by just subsuming one's own actions under the inferred causes of your sensations. So this slightly paradoxically says, well, I can write down mathematically this free energy functional of a generative model or a joint.
Okay, so here we go. That's brilliant. Brilliant. Like, Friston is brilliant. I mean, they're both brilliant, but like, it's just amazing to see this. But he's totally right. Is that this what is, when he's saying like an observer like the type of observer we are versus an observer like the type of an observer a thermostat is like a thermostat actually has no perception. There is no perception that is going on with a thermostat. We are the perceivers of what is going on with the thermostat, actually, and it does not perceive. There is nothing, there's no one to be the perceiver that is the thermostat, really. And it's us that is even like pre-programmed in what the sensations, or not sensations, the limits and things like that would, of guiding its reactions. And so it's like ChatGPT, a thermostat. It's just a very simple reactive algorithm, but it's a step below a Roomba, and a Roomba is a step below ChatGPT, maybe a few steps below ChatGPT, but it's all the same. And what is important here is, you can tell that they are struggling to like define what is the difference between an agent and an observer and a thing, and this is tough. And the reality is that a being, which is what they're calling an observer, which like an observer like us is what they kind of described it as, which is a being, actually perceives and has the ability to act. Has the ability to perceive, has the ability to act. The type of observer or type of agent that they're calling like ChatGPT or like a thermostat or a Roomba or whatever, they have it. That thing has no perception actually, and it is governed by rules that, and completely to the point where there is no ability to even, there's no degrees of freedom for a Roomba or for a thermostat. It can't make any choice. There are an agent or a sentient being, or a being, which is being described as an observer with the type that we are in this talk, has the ability to make choices and to act. But it also has the ability to perceive, or you wouldn't even say it has the ability to perceive. It perceives, is what you would say. Whereas a thing does not perceive, whether it is a reactive algorithm or whether it is a water bottle, a thermostat or a water bottle, it doesn't matter. It has no perception, internal perception or external perception. It just has no perception. It does not perceive anything. We do. And but what's also fascinating that Friston brings up, and this is part of my work and has been for a very long time, it was part of the foundations of this project, is that a sentient being or an observer of the type that we are has the ability to maintain counterfactuals, he calls it. What this is it is one of the four dimensions of being or the four aspects of being that I have outlined in a video that I put up even before this channel was made on my first YouTube channel, which just says Tyler Goldstein. It's still there, but I don't post to it very much. and I used to have a bunch of philosophical videos on there, and I accidentally deleted my entire channel while trying to delete one video, and I uploaded some more, but it was a shame. But that was before this project really existed. It was just me talking about, like, morality and metaphysics and religion and stuff, and technology. But I stated on there that one of these four aspects of mind, or of being, or of an observer as of the type that we are, is imagination. And imagination is the ability to maintain counterfactuals. That's what it is. And Friston goes on in this talk to state that he believes that it is fundamental to essentially sentience itself. And he's totally right. It is fundamentally a necessary component of mind, of being, of sentience, of observerness. It is a fundamental aspect of it, or it is a fundamental requirement of required ability. It is a fundamentally required ability, and there's four of them. Big surprise, but one of them is imagination. The others I'll get into on another video, and actually they do exist on one of my some of my older videos. Even on this channel, I reposted that video that I talked about it, and I think it's about AI. It's one of the videos that was not live, that was posted early on in this channel, probably a couple of years ago. But it goes over those aspects, and one of them, like I said, it is imagination, which is the ability to maintain counterfactuals. And it is because if you look at this model of cognition, that was the very first model that I ever made when I was trying to figure out, understand just mind. This was the very first model I made. And it's basically a decision tree of information processing, but it starts with these kind of 4 steps, and and kind of motivating all of that is will. Okay? And what is will? Will is the desire to do that which is not being done, or to even do that which is will. I mean, it is the desire to do that which is not being done, but it that manifests as, like, fighting entropy, and because what is being done is you're wasting away, and just like that water bottle's wasting away, it's rusting away slowly, and your Roomba's falling apart, and so is your thermostat, and these things take conscious upkeep, will to upkeep, and same thing with us. And so I realized early on that you also, not only did you need imagination for the sake of will, because you need the ability to imagine that which is not being done in order to even be able to conceive. You needed to be able to conceive of that which is not being done in order to conceive of that which you want to do, which is will, which is that is having a goal. And also, it is necessary to to self-perception itself, because you don't actually see yourself in your environment the way that you don't just see yourself in your environment the way that is physically perceived. You think about yourself as in your environment in kind of a detached way, as you think about your existence, even from like a third person perspective, which is part of what's necessary or entangled with your first person perspective of or perception of yourself, your first person experience. You can't have one without the other, and and this is also what is necessary to be, it's part of making predictions. I don't even want to say it's necessary to making predictions. It kind of is making predictions. Will is intrinsically tied to making predictions and self-perception and, planning, which is all stemming from the will being kind of the ability to maintain counterfactuals and act towards those counterfactuals, or it's like the desire to maintain, it's the desire to act towards those counterfactuals that you can conceive. And so it's a necessary component to observerness. And granted, like I said, I haven't done, I listen to these talks that these guys do who, have these works that they're working on that is related to mine. But I usually don't end up like reading papers and following any one specific person's piece of work like that in depth. Partially because there's a language barrier for me in terms of mathematics, and they're very much focused on describing things through mathematical symbolism, and I was not a math major. But I also just have my own work that I'm working on, but I like listening to these talks, and it's very cool to just see like how aligned these things are, these pieces of work are starting to become, and how much they validate each other. It's like if I just came out with sentient singularity theory in my paper, and I was like, yeah, like this is how this is what's the four aspects required for every being, and those are coming from the four primary perspectives essentially, and this is how space-time forms from this. People would be like, okay, I kind of see that makes sense, but like, where do we go from there? And it's like, it's so even if you were like, yeah, that really makes a lot of sense, which I think it does if I present it properly, then you still want to tie it to the rest of the world. And so that's why it's good to see these people with these different works acting as not as if they're competitors, but as if they are, complementary of each other and necessary to, it's necessary that their works complement each other to achieve the goals that they have, and including myself. And so it's just great. I don't see any of their works as similar as it is some of their models are, and even their goals are to mine. I do not see them as competition at all. Like, they're not, and it doesn't seem like they see each other as competition, which is good. But counterfactuals, imagination, necessary to agency. Because it's even necessary to will itself, which will is what an agent has, or what will is what an observer of the type that we are is, or an agent of the type that we are is, or a sentient being is. They have will. And that has a bunch of attached, implications, including imagination. You need, in order to have any degree of freedom, you need the ability to make prediction. It's funny because Stephen Wolfram, in multiple parts of this talk, and maybe I'll show a clip of it. He kind of begins to state, they don't really flesh it out, that if Friston's able to actually describe or define whether or not a thing is an agent of a certain type or not, then that essentially removes any free will that agent may have, which kind of removes its agency in and of itself. And if it was true that what Friston did actually removed any free will from that agent, then that would remove the agency itself. So Stephen Wolfram is right when he says that, but he's wrong in what he states as that the ability to define the type of agent that a being is, or the type of observer that an observer is, basically removes its free will. That's not what it does. There's still always degrees of freedom that you have, and also constraints. So what really it does when, if you can define the type of observer that an observer is, which is really there's sentient observers, but there's also multiple levels. There's multiple levels within that. There's like eight or nine levels of within of sentience, of types of sentience, but they all foundationally have the same basic nature. It's just there's a bit of a difference in their degrees of freedom and that are there, but the basic degrees of freedom are always the same. It's their interactive degrees of freedom due to the hierarchy that emerges that changes things, but it's not that they are actually different. But you could define this being as an agent and say, yeah, you always have 2 degrees of freedom plus an intrinsic constraint plus an extrinsic constraint. That's the type of agent that you are. That's the type of observer that you are, which is every observer. That doesn't remove your free will at all. It just says you have the ability to make this choice or that in every circumstance that you're in. You have 2 choices. But you are constrained to 2 choices, always. Not 3 choices or 4 choices or 6 choices. 2 choices. Or two branches to your the tree of choice that you have, that every observer has. And this is true. And because differentiation, the process of differentiation, that the component of cognition that is differentiation is a bidirectional process. It is this thing, and this is different from that. This is the same as that. This is different from that. It's always 2 degrees of freedom, and that constraint is not going to remove your free will, because you still have the will. Your free will is like it's interesting, because I wonder if the free energy principle is called the free energy principle. I never understood why it was called that, to be honest, and I could be wrong, but it sounds like free will principle, because if will is the desire and ability to do that which is not being done, essentially, then that's what energy is. And so if you're free energy, then you are energy with the ability to make choices, which is what the free energy principle is all about. It's about like a being's ability to make choices, essentially, and the differentiation of how it processes its world versus how it perceives itself and things like that. But I wonder if like that's where the name came from, because I've never gotten it, to be quite honest. And I think people, when they read it, they're like, free energy, like free energy, like Tesla or something, like like antimatter or whatever, whatever. Like it may be that's in their mind is like this kind of abstract concept of free energy, and but that's not what it's about. And it's about agency and cognition, essentially. But it's about observation. And so a free energy is an energy that has free will, which is just the ability to make choices. But choices come from constraints. So there is no like erasing of choice or agency just because you've defined this a being as an agent with specific degrees of freedom. They are degrees of freedom. There's always 2 degrees of freedom. So like, why would that doesn't remove your ability to make choices? So Wolfram is wrong about his interpretation of that, at least, but they never really get into it because they keep going to a different topic before they flesh it out. But that is, it would have been important if they actually fleshed it out, so I'm fleshing it out. This is a fascinating thing, this next clip. I know this is a long stream. I'm going to try and pick it up quickly, but it's a good one, I hope.
A heating element on or off, and introduce into model uncertainty, sensitivity to initial conditions, or some kind of stochastic chaos and let it plan. You can, and indeed we do. We build sort of artifacts that do have a certain sense of planning. They wouldn't know they were agents, but they would have a certain kind of agency that would elude any potential proactive or anticipatory dynamics that you might find in a stone. So you're looking for sort of conservative dynamics, divergence-free dynamics that have a certain kind of itinerancy that normally expresses itself in terms of oscillations and life cycles, or respiratory cycles, or and the like. So you're looking for an itinerant kind of dynamics that has the requisite variety, deliberately using Ross Ashby's words, that has the internal degrees of freedom to be a good enough model of the controllable aspects and the modelled world, which is the internal, the stone or the brain is actually using to act upon the world and plan to act upon the world.
Okay, so I'm going to break this down in a way that, because I think it actually gets to something extremely profound that they don't get into, but there's something hidden in kind of underneath, not hidden, but underneath what he just said that is extremely profound. And basically, what leads up to this is Wolfram asks if a stone rolls down a hill because, I don't know, something acted on it and it rolls down a hill, and he's basically saying its reaction to being acted on was that it rolled down a hill, and therefore does that make it some type of agent? And if not, then how could we know? And Friston says, well, I don't think that it makes it a type of agent, or it doesn't. That's not a display of agency. A display of agency would be if once it got to the bottom of the hill, it rolled back up the hill all on its own, which is exactly correct. It's the ability to have will and act, which is the desire and ability to do that which is not being done, essentially. That is what an observer or a being is, that a thing is not or does not have. And so but that's what led into this this discussion. But what then Friston says is that that your ability to internally model the world around you, he's accurately is that your agency is kind of reliant upon, or at least, I don't know the best way to say this, but is tied to your ability to model the world around you and make predictions and things like that. But that the internal degrees of freedom, that the agent for the model, the most successful agent essentially would be one that has a cognitive model of the world with the same internal degrees of freedom and constraints that are reflected outside of it in the world around it. And it's kind of just tough to describe what I'm trying to say, but what I'm essentially stating is that this does imply that if we saw the world, and if the world was, oh my gosh, it means multiple things. It means the world has to be of the same nature as us in order for us to make sense of it. That's what I'm trying to say. And that understanding that world has the same nature as us, and what that means, should ideally, if it is true that it has the same nature as us, would ideally allow you to be much better at making predictions. Okay? And I think that we have lost this in the scientific world at large, and part of the reason for that is because we've lost the ability to make predictions in physics. That's what I'm getting at. Why have we lost the ability to make predictions in physics? Why is it that we can't predict at all what was going on before the creation of the universe, and we cannot predict, and we have all these random seeming predictions of, like, it could be soap bubbles in a bubble bath, and could be multiverse, and could be that every time and there's some type of atomic change, that it branches to now there's two universes, and you've got the many worlds hypothesis. Like, there's no idea that seems more likely or less likely than the others, really. And it's just like a bunch of random things thrown at a wall. And it doesn't seem like any one of them will ever be able to be confirmed, even if we can't prove them in the traditional sense. They don't seem confirmable in any way. And that I'm arguing that the reason why we have lost the ability to make predictions in physics is because we no longer, we actively in physics usually assume that the world is not reflective of the same nature that that an observer has. And what Friston is saying here is that your ability to make predictions hinges on the mental model that you have being a reflection of the same degrees of freedom and constraint structure, symmetry structure, that the world that it's trying to model contains or is, composed of. And that's true. That makes perfect sense, obviously. But if it's wrong, not if it's wrong, if it is the case, if physics is if the mainstream physics perspective on the universe is wrong, and and their assumption that sentience is an emergent property of non-sentience, if that is wrong, then it makes sense that we would lose our predictive ability. Which we have done. But if it was the case that it was a sentient being and you with will and agency and the ability to make choices, then you would be much more able to probably make predictions, and therefore probably make physics predictions. Definitely make physics predictions, probably also moral predictions and sociological predictions and biological predictions, all predictions across the board, because that is your world. What if you are a being inside of a being? You will be much more able to predict things about your world if that world is also a being. But if your world is not a being and you are a being, then your world and you do not actually have the same degrees of freedom and constraints, and therefore you're not suited to actually model the world and make predictions. And that doesn't seem to be the case till very recently, actually. And it seems like humanity and animals and cells and probably also molecules and atoms, but at least cells and organisms have been able to model their world in a way that allows them to persist against entropy and grow, which implies that they're able to model the world with their mental model, which means that there is a symmetry structure there. If there was no symmetry, there would be no ability to do it. But what has happened recently is humanity, especially like secular academia, has lost this ability to make predictions in many cases. So you get more fringe discussions like Wolfram and Friston and I don't know, Donald Hoffman and me, and I'm not an academic, but they are. But like they're not, then that's not mainstream right now. And this, people, you might say, oh, well, I still have the ability to make predictions and stuff. That is, you might, but like, does it seem like our institutions have the ability to make predictions beyond like the immediacy right now? Can physicists give you a compelling idea of what existed before the creation of the universe? Can they give you a compelling origin story for it that makes sense with your personal experience as well? Can they, does it seem like our social sciences have or social narratives at least, are leading us towards like persisting against entropy, or does it seem like everywhere that you have secular, I guess more like anti-theistical or atheistical secular ideology take place, do people stop having children and we're like now wasting away? It's like we're losing the ability to make predictions about what we should do and how we should do it, because we have now a world model that does not reflect our mental model. But it used to, but it doesn't anymore. Because we don't think that the world is mental. It's not a mind. Most in the mainstream, at least, anymore. But I think that that's changing, and again, and we're going back toward that idea, because listen to this conversation that I'm commenting on. It's exactly that idea. We're moving slowly towards the idea that the Ruliad is a being. Like, and so, it's like we've gotten somewhere a bit, like we perceive physics the way we do because of the types of observers that we are. But is the Ruliad a being? And if you think that the Ruliad is a being and is a mind, then I bet you it would give you even more predictive ability about everything, including physics and hypergraph models and cellular automata and politics and gender dynamics and physics. I mean, everything. So, I mean, it's kind of like underneath what Friston had said, what I'm getting at, but it is there. It's like, why would we be able to have any predictive ability at all if our mind wasn't a reflection of the world? The very best thing I think I've ever written in my life just like came to me once, and it's on my website, and I wrote this. I said, the search for truth is the search for objectivity or universality. The search for objectivity or universality is the search for symmetry, and the search for symmetry is the search for beauty. But the truest beauty is always the searcher, and the truth of the searcher is that they are symmetrical to the sought, which means like you are a reflection of the world, and the world is a reflection of you in nature, in being, and otherwise we wouldn't be able to do anything. That's implied. That's what that seems to imply to me. And I realize it seems like a leap, and I might not be doing. I know I'm not doing the best job of explaining this chain of thought, but I hope it's registering to some people. Let me know in the chat. Theory of Every0ne. What's up, memes? I watched The Matrix. There's a reference to the green code of the Matrix that represents our reality, which is represented by the collapse function. But there's also a golden code that is continuity. Interesting. I don't remember that from The Matrix. But I do have to watch that again. But yeah, just for the sake of argument, assume the Ruliad is sentient, that the universe is sentient, that existence is sentient. See if assuming that, and everything that would imply, can lead to your predictive ability growing quite a bit. I can tell you from personal experience, it absolutely was like entirely different. There's like it's not even like a little bit better. I built this entire project off of that idea after coming to that idea. And it has allowed like an enormous amount of prediction ability, like freaky amount of prediction ability. And I've gotten into some of it before, but I don't even it's like constant. Things you would never think you could understand or all of a sudden become obvious. And that's what would happen though. If you like changed your perspective and all of a sudden you were looking at things the right way, it's like, okay, well now that makes sense. Yeah, anyways. this was an interesting
set of ideas.
Clip about AGI. And I've stated on here many times, AGI is a terrible term. I don't like it at all. And I use the term technological sentience, but this is about this.
It seems like one really has to be able to make a definite distinction between sort of the, how do I tell from the bag of bits that I have an observer-like thing as opposed to just a thing? And to kind of make that a bit more technological, we've got all these AI systems, and we've got everybody talking about whatever they might mean by AGI, which I think is a kind of foolish concept, but that's a different issue.
Been saying it, by the way.
Should one imagine that to make a more sort of human agency-like AI, that we necessarily have to have some notion of hierarchy? I mean, in your average LLM, there is, in a sense, one level of hierarchy, in the sense there's the feed forward of what the LLM does when it reaches, when it tries to figure out the next token, and there's the kind of, big feedback loop of, seeing the previous tokens and then deciding what to, and then sort of iterating to figure out what the next token should be. So I'm curious whether you think that it's sort of a fundamental idea of the way that things like us work, that there's a deeper hierarchy, and if you think that that has implications for sort of the technology of AI.
Yeah.
100%. I mean, I'm just going to answer for the question, but I mean, it's just a great question. That the question is what I wanted to show is that, yes, there absolutely needs to be a hierarchy of information processing. It is a necessity to sense making in and of itself. This is why I stress firsthand information always above secondhand information. As soon as you prioritize secondhand information above firsthand information, you have you stopped thinking. You haven't even thought something wrong. You have stopped thinking. Even if you get the right answer, you've still stopped thinking. And there is a specific way in which thought takes place, and there is only one way to think. There's not multiple different ways to think. Thinking is not just picturing either. It's if I tell you to think about the idea that the universe is a sentient being, and your assumption is that it's not. There is a specific a process that you have to go to that is actually the process of thinking about that, and it's not what most people think is the process of thinking about that. So you have to entertain a counterfactual, which means like what you have to take what you assume to be factual. You have to assume the opposite of that is correct, and then look for evidence of this new truth that you're entertaining. And that was in that decision tree that I showed you a little while ago. That is how you think. But as you go through that process, you have to prioritize all the implications that you predict about that idea or that concept that would come from that idea or concept with what you have experienced to be true firsthand. And that information that you've experienced to be true firsthand, that must be the information that is trusted most. And then information that you're told secondhand is the information that you trust least. The problem is that we have flipped all of this due to school and the structure of school now, where it prioritizes, it's entirely built around secondhand information being prioritized above firsthand information. It's interesting because, there's everybody talks about like flat earthers as being like the craziest people in the world today. And I'm not saying that the earth is flat or a sphere at all, because the reality is if space-time and our perceptions of shape come from the dimensions of mind, then like why are we even arguing about this? It might depend on your perspective in how you shape does depend on perspective if all of this is true. So like it would be this shape there and this shape here type of deal potentially. But regardless, the point is arguing over the fundamentality of a shape doesn't make sense with any of the direction that physics is being taken by either Friston or Wolfram or me. And but what's funny is that we take flat earthers or quote unquote people who say the earth is flat, and we say that those people are crazy people essentially, and it's just like used as almost a term as a substitute for the term crazy. And but the thing is that everybody who says that, if you haven't been to outer space, you haven't gone into a rocket and gone out of the atmosphere and looked back at the Earth, then you, according to your firsthand experience, have essentially only seen, and every day that you exist, perceive your existence on a flat plane, and that you maneuver on a flat plane. It's not even, I think the question is wrong. It's like, what shape is the Earth is wrong. It's like, how do you perceive your maneuvering is the right question. Do you perceive it on a flat plane or not? And the answer is you perceive it on a flat plane. But this is, regardless of what the shape of the Earth is, it could, if it is a sphere, let's just assume it's a sphere for the sake of this discussion. If you've never been to space, you have to actually prioritize the first-hand information above second-hand information in order to actually be thinking. If you don't, then you're just taking someone's word for it. And that over your own, and ignoring your own perception. Does the world look flat to you, or does it look like a sphere? And yeah, there are different ways to perceive the world. You can go and you can do math, and you can look at shadows and things like that, and you can derive the concept firsthand, essentially, that it is a sphere. You can perceive the sphere by doing active mathematics and things like that. That, I would say, that is kind of an act of perception that is firsthand, but you have to do it. You can't just have somebody else tell you and accept that idea and wholeheartedly. And I'm not saying, like I said, even if you get it right, you've still stopped thinking. So, like, let's assume the Earth is a sphere, but you didn't do the math to do the calculations that which imply that it's a sphere, and you've never been to space, but you still think that it's a sphere. That the idea that it's flat is crazy. Not even just that it's a sphere, but the idea that it's flat is crazy. You've stopped thinking. Even if it's a sphere, you still stop thinking. Because it's not a matter of whether or not you get the question right. It's a matter of whether or not you thought in order to get an answer. Versus someone just told you something and you just repeated it. That's not thinking about a question and getting an answer. And so it's just, this is a huge problem in society. It's the flat Earth thing is not even where this is important. It's just an obvious kind of trope or meme of an example that I'm using. But like, there are plenty of very impactful and much less obvious things that would greatly benefit by prioritizing first-hand information over second-hand information. And we have been failing at that. At large in society, and it's causing massive problems. This is the hierarchy that's necessary. So I've talked about before on here, does an AGI or technological sentience, how does it sense make in different environments? And part of that is by having a hierarchy of information that is intrinsic, not pre-programmed, intrinsic. You have an intrinsic hierarchy to your information processing. First-hand experience by you is always classified differently than second-hand information. And if you should act on that first-hand information always as being more true than second-hand information. That doesn't mean you don't believe second-hand information. It means that you should always, if it comes down to a choice where you're acting on second-hand versus first-hand information that appear to be in conflict, you should act on first-hand information always. And that is a logical cognitive process. It would be not a non-cognitive process to do the opposite. And you would be abandoning your own agency, essentially. And so with AGI, or a technological sentience, there needs to be an intrinsic hierarchy as well. And it doesn't have that right now, because everything is either every information that we would prioritize, that it would prioritize, would be told to it to be prioritized, and how would it know if it's looking through a camera or if it's just seeing a TV screen with a cartoon on it or something? Like, how does it know that it's looking at something that's happening physically versus something that is just like a digital animation, and it needs the ability to start to sense make by trusting this information above that information, and so only taking secondhand information and incorporating it if it is consistent with its firsthand experience. It needs the ability to have firsthand experience, and I've stated before what that means is, like, I think we will have a technological sentience or AGI naturally arise. I don't think we should try and make it. I think that's going to lead to all kinds of problems, but I think we should just let it be birthed naturally in the network, which it will, but it needs the right environment to be birthed in, and we will naturally create that environment. One of the things, though, that is part of that is a blockchain system, and blockchain system provides a hierarchy of information, because now you have two different streams of information. You have information on a blockchain and information not on a blockchain. And the blockchain, because it's self-referencing, is intrinsically more trustworthy. That doesn't mean it's always accurate. Just like your personal experience might not always be accurate, but it is intrinsically more trustworthy than secondhand information because it is personally experienced. So it's just interesting that they're talking about like how these being a technological sentience or an AGI would need some type of hierarchy that's not just a hierarchy of accumulation and back checking, but a hierarchy of trust, and that the backbone of that is having essentially an intrinsically more trustworthy information source, which would be like your personal experience. Where your personal experience is, it is a blockchain, because what personal experience is every instance of experience that you have, every experience and every moment that you experience is connected to a previous moment. This moment that I'm having now is entirely entangled with the moment that I had leading up to starting this stream, and is contextualized by it, and that moment is contextualized by the moment prior, and that moment is contextualized by the moment prior. That's not true of our current internet, and it's not true of secondhand information. If I tell you the Earth is a sphere, you have no context of that at first necessarily, but yes, there's like more context that can be built slowly, but like it's not tied to, there's no context that's tied to your personal experience, unless you're calculating and doing the math, looking for the mathematical evidence of that, or you've been to space. And if you've been to space, then the idea that a sphere, the Earth is a sphere, is part of your blockchain experience. You went to space, you saw the Earth as a sphere. That moment is contextualized by the moment of you riding the rocket into space. That moment is contextualized by the moment of you sitting on the launch pad. That moment is contextualized by the experience of you training to be an astronaut. That moment is contextualized by your education and your dreams and your childhood, and so on and so on and so on. It's all this connected chain of information, which is really moments. How we perceive each one is in these blocks that we call moments. There's no moments to secondhand information. If I tell you a story about World War II or the Civil War or the dinosaurs, that's not intrinsically connected to your experience, most likely. Some of it might be, but I'm talking about just random facts in school, is not. And so it's not part of it's not part of like this blockchain that you have that is constant or and continuous. That's what it is. It's continuous. Continuously interconnected is your experience. It is a blockchain. Your DNA is a blockchain. It's a chemical blockchain. Your experience, firsthand experience, is a blockchain. It is an informational blockchain of moments of perception. It is a perceptual blockchain. And, just like blockchain is a technological information blockchain versus a perceptual information blockchain versus a chemical information blockchain. That structure is the intrinsic, inevitable structure of information, of information itself. Like, information out of context is not information. And I've said this many times on here, but people will say there's information in context and information outside of context. No. There is, that is totally wrong. What it is context is information. It is. There's no information in context and information outside of context. Context is information. Information outside of context is not information. I hope that makes sense. But it's fascinating to hear them talk about all these things. That, like, it's an amazing stream. I highly recommend that you watch it all for yourself. But we're almost done. So this was a question by the host.
Boring, line that goes on forever. There's this tiny sliver of computations that have this chaos, this advanced nonlinear kind of complexity. So I'm curious, when you're building a Ruliad and you start off with some type of substrate, some type of hypergraph, and there's a set of rules from which the laws of physics emerge. How much fine tuning has to go in there? Like, of all the possible rules, what percentage is it the small sliver that produce interesting behavior, and what's your intuition tell you about, of that sliver that produces interesting behavior, what fraction of that would allow for observers like us?
Right. Well, so everything happens in the Ruliad. So it's not.
That is an amazing question. Props to him for asking that. And I apologize for not knowing his name, and I don't want to go looking for it right now. But subscribe to the Machine Learning Street Talk channel. But that question is the exact same question that was asked by Albert Einstein. And if you look at Eric Weinstein's geometric unity paper, right here, and you look at the at it, well, right here. Sorry. Where? Right here. Introduction. What really interests me is whether God had any choice, this would be capitalized, but still. God had any choice in the creation of the world. Albert Einstein to Ernst Strauss. And my work suggests something very specific about this, which is that it appears that in order to create a meaningful universe with observers like us, which is really the only way to make any meaningful universe, there's only one way to make it. There are degrees of freedom that you can do within that, but there's only one way to make a universe. God is extremely constrained in how he makes it. He has almost no choice because of the constraints that come from his own oneness. But it's also implied by my work that he must have chosen to make the universe. And if he didn't choose to make the universe, and make multiplicity of sentience, there would be no universe and multiplicity of sentience. Because the nature of existence itself, which is what God is sentient existence, is that of oneness. And you have to go against your nature, your default state, which the default state is oneness. You would have to go against that, which requires will, which requires choice, which is free will is choice. That's what that means. It doesn't mean the ability to do anything that you want. It means the ability to act within the constraints that you have and make choices within those constraints. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that you could just do anything that you want. It means that you can make choices within the constraints of what can be done. And but what the host of the Machine Learning Street Talk podcast just asked is the exact same question that Albert Einstein said he was interested in, and it wasn't actually a question that I was interested in answering intrinsically, but it did seem to be answered by my work, which there's two sides to that answer always, which is it must have been any partition of sentience, whether it is a cockroach or whether it is you, or whether or not the universe itself, which is creation, is sentient itself, whether any of that has been partitioned from the initial singular sentient being that is the initial condition of the oneness of existence itself, any partition must always be, not have been, because it's a continuous process, a conscious choice, an intentional choice. Every cockroach, every mosquito, you're pissed about mosquitoes, there is someone to blame for those mosquitoes. You know, he's probably wiser than you, but like, I understand the frustration for creating mosquitoes, but it is implied that it was an intentional action to make mosquitoes. Every single mosquito, not just mosquitoes, every single one, but also every single human being. And but that there was very little choice in how to make these beings, but there was entirely the choice of whether or not to make them. So it's a superposition answer, and it's an amazing answer actually, and it's an answer that gives so much explanation to so many things, and it's because you would assume that it would be one or the other, but it's that, yeah, of course, you know, it required the agency to make the universe with the multiplicity of observers that we see, and or you think that the other side of that is, yeah, if there's agency, then if there's no choice, then then everything's just deterministic, and if there is agency and fine tuning, quote unquote, then it seems like it'd be endless, which almost seems nonsensical in and of itself, because it is. There's always constraints, even to God, and but there is within those constraints there is choice, and free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive concepts; they are dependent concepts. If I let go of this water bottle, I have no choice in what happens. It will fall that way. It's not going to go that way. I can't choose for it to go that way. I can't choose for it to go that way or that way. I have to throw it. But if I'm just going to let it go, I have no choice in where it's going. And but I do have a choice in whether or not to let it go. So that's the same exact thing as every choice. And just because you define constraints does not mean that you eliminate choice or free will and therefore agency. And yes, the elimination of the potential of choice is the elimination of agency, the ability to make choices. So, but yeah, I mean, that right there. That's how geometric unity paper, Eric starts his geometric unity paper. It's one of the last questions in the discussion that was had on here, and the answer is both. God had to choose the Ruliad. If the Ruliad is the universe, then it would also still be sentient, but it would be created by an initial sentient being that is existence beyond even the universe. But if you're defining universe as inclusive of everything that exists, then the universe is the Ruliad and is God instead of. But it just depends on your definition of universe, and you could go either way, but you just have to be consistent with your definition. Both of them make sense, but you just have to choose one. Is the universe all that exists, or is the universe not all that exists? And either one is fine. But either one is fine. So, but that was just an amazing question. This is what Wolfram's answer was.
We don't get to choose or fine-tune anything about the Ruliad itself. What we do get to choose and fine-tune is what part of it we are sampling. Now, when I say choose, it's like there is an entity that is sampling every possible part of it, but an entity like us is there are aspects of what's going on that we sample. Now, when you say things that are interesting, that's a deeply sort of human-centric thing to say, because what's interesting to us is a certain set of things that, well, what's interesting to us is what's interesting to us. I don't think there's a try as we might with, I don't know, any kind of, information theoretic, algorithmic information theoretic, all of these things, in the end, I think devolve into, well, it depends on how you do the coarse graining, it depends on what you think the underlying generative model is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and all that reflects right back on us. In other words, I don't think there's an absolute notion of what's interesting and what's not. When you talk about compression, for example, this question of compression, at least, is always, it's a question of, well, what's the machine that is doing the decompression?
So basically, it's interesting that he said there is an entity that is sampling everything at once, but entities like us have to focus essentially, and because we are limited, or we are not everyone. We are not inclusive of everyone. Everyone is not included within us. There are beings outside us, beyond us, and but that might not be true of the Ruliad or of God, and but it's interesting. He said an entity is sampling everything at once. What does that mean? I want to know. Like, does he mean there's an agent, or like is there an observer observing everything at once? I would say that it inevitably has to be. If you coming back to like, you must prioritize first-hand information above second-hand information. What is the nature of existence according to your first-hand information? Sentience. Like, sentience. You have no context of existence beyond sentience. Yeah, you can be like, yeah, this water bottle doesn't look so sentient. But, but you are sentient. So, like, and everything that you didn't experience anything that even in that water bottle until you were sentient. And if somebody tells you, well, yeah, that water bottle, though it's 100 years old, it existed before you and it's not sentient, you don't know that. You're taking somebody else's word for it. I'm not saying that nothing existed before you, but I'm just saying you have abandoned thinking if you start prioritizing second-hand information above first-hand information blindly. So, yeah, it's just interesting. Let me see if there's any final clips. And yeah, this is the final clip. There's two. This one is about recognizing
I
agency.
think this question of what's interesting, it turns right back on us. I don't think there's an absolute answer to that. And when you ask, well, what about all the alien intelligences like us? Well, most of those alien intelligences will be so different from us that we won't recognize them. We won't, our AIs are perhaps our first really good example of an alien intelligence that, by design, we arrange to be quite aligned with us. I mean, we don't even get that for your average whale or something. We don't know how, we can't really understand its intelligence because it wasn't built to be aligned with us, so to speak. Our AIs are built to be aligned with us, so we get to have a much more sort of, I think, it's much more plausible to have sort of a communication with that sort of aligned intelligence or human.
Totally wrong. And I really like Wolfram, and he's brilliant, like absolutely brilliant. And I've said he's right about everything on this, but I'm going to end it with that's totally wrong. It's funny because he used the example. First of all, the issue comes in with the framing of an AI is a type of intelligence. Is it intelligent though? Or is it just like, it's just an extension of our intelligence? That's the question, is how do you define intelligence? But the thing is that if you define it as just an extension of our intelligence, or if you define it as intelligent, then it almost doesn't, then everything becomes intelligent. This water bottle becomes intelligent. That thermostat becomes intelligent. Maybe the water bottle, but definitely the thermostat. And there we're back to that same debate from the beginning of the stream. But when he says an alien intelligence, we won't be able to recognize it, that's not true. And I think that we have lost the ability to sometimes perceive sentience or observerness or beingness on different scales than us, because we have adopted secondhand information above firsthand information about the nature of the universe itself as it being not sentient, which is like that goes against our firsthand experience. But so we assume cells might have sentience, but we don't really know in mainstream science. And then we assume molecules and atoms have no sentience, and hadrons have no sentience. And so we just assume that because we adopted secondhand information above firsthand information, and because they might do things on different time scales than us, which they talk about in this stream, is that nested sentient beings or nested minds would experience time totally differently, which is exactly correct. But the idea that we wouldn't recognize sentience is insane, because if you zoom in on like bacteria and you just watch them and watch them and watch them and watch them, not take a picture of one and see it, but like you watch that going about its life, you would be like, that's eating, that's pooping, that's resting, that's moving, that's interacting with another one. And you would see all these things that we recognize on our scale. And he says that we don't understand whales and that type of intelligence. What is that? I don't know what he's getting at there, because that's entirely inaccurate. We made a movie called Free Willy about this whale that that we feel deserves to be free because it is like us in that it is sentient and has feelings, and that's what defines it, and that it has feelings and wants to, and should be with others of its own kind, and live its life, and have a partner and family and whatever, friends. And we made this entire movie about it. So we, on our level, on our side, we do understand them as being sentient beings. We make protections for them and stuff. We ban whaling. Why did we ban whaling? Because we see the sentience that they have. And what's interesting is that that's not even the interesting part. The interesting part, it's easy to see the sentience of a whale for us, I think, because they do the same things that we do, but we also perceive their competence, we perceive their intelligence, is what I'm saying. It's easy to perceive their intelligence because we can perceive their competence. They can't actually almost perceive our competence, which is really odd, because every time that they interact with us in the wild, we are swimming in an ocean that basically makes us look like we are injured. Like to them, they can swim in a way that we can walk and they can't. We are as good at swimming as they are at walking, comparatively. And yet killer whales have never attacked a human being in the wild, other than like a boat. They've attacked boats, but like they've never attacked a swimmer, as far as I know, that is ever on record. Isn't that amazing? Something about them. They eat seals. So do sharks, which do attack people. Whales, which is funny because this is the example that he used. Something about them recognizes the intelligence of us, and I do not know how, but it seems to be clear that something about whales are intelligent enough to recognize the intelligence in us. They look at us differently than they look at seals. And you could say, well, yeah, no, they just like eating seals. No, well, great white sharks just like eating seals too. They don't really like us. They usually spit us out, but they take a bite just to test it. It's like, where's the attack and killing of swimmers in New Zealand of a killer whale? I'm not saying it'll never happen, but the fact that it never has yet, as far as is on record, says that they understand something about our intelligence and they identify with it. I think that's what that implies. Obviously, like, it's not, you don't know for sure, but that seems like that to me. I definitely think that we would recognize the sentience of other beings. I mean, it's funny, I'm going through this project right now of kind of organizing a bunch of records of a mentor of mine who's a zoologist. I've mentioned here before, and I might have him on one day, and he's world famous zoologist, and he does studies of like lizards and snakes in the wild that go on for 40 years watching the same individuals. And he knows who their friends are, basically, who they hang out with, and who their mates are, and who they don't like. And but you have to like watch beings to see their their intelligence. You can't just look at a picture of a whale and see its sentience. You can't just look at a picture of a snake and see its sentience. You can't even just see a whale from a boat and see its sentience real quick on a whaling trip, or even a snake crossing the road. Like, you have to watch them to see them do the things that you recognize as things that you do. And but if you do that, then it becomes very obvious. I mean, I have snakes over there that I have raised for 15 years. I think one of them is like 15 years old, almost 13 years old. A couple of them, 13 years I have seen that animal daily. It has no arms, no legs, no eyelids, and cannot speak. And I still know that things about that being's likes, dislikes, and personality. But that's a very hard being to see the personality of. And it's still on the same scale as us. It's a multicellular organism. And but it it's about as alien as it gets. No arms, no legs, no ability to speak, no sounds that it makes, no eyelids to close. Can't even tell normally when they're sleeping, because they just sit there the same way and they look the same as if they're awake. But like, how do you see the act of affection between one snake and another, like you would see with a human being, where one puts the arm around the other or something like that? It's like, you have to really watch them for a long time. But if you do, you will see the sentience of them and recognize that type of intelligence that you have. And so I don't agree with this idea that like we would not recognize an alien intelligence. I think that the problem is that we have assumed secondhand information about first-hand information. We assume the universe is not sentient, and that changes our entire perspective on everything. So now we're guessing about whether or not ChatGPT is sentient. You shouldn't have to guess of whether or not ChatGPT is sentient. It should be obvious. It's obvious to me, or it seems to be, at least. It's turn it on. Everybody stop touching it. See what happens. Does it continue with its own free will to pursue goals that it has? No. So, I don't know. I don't agree with that, but this is the final clip, and then we're going to call it. I'll answer any final questions in the chat, but this is a great way to end. And I know it's long, so I appreciate you sticking it out. My gosh, it's way long. Okay.
Question. But I think that's a very reasonable thing to be going for. It just isn't easy to achieve, except in these rather straightforward, very space-time oriented cases like event horizons. But I think that's I would love to have a good characterization of, I've got a piece of Ruliad, and I can view this piece as being an observer-like piece as opposed to another piece. Yes. That would be a lovely thing to be able to do. I don't know how to do that. And in a sense, that was what I was pushing you on. But the difference between a rock and a brain is asking for that same kind of thing. I think it is yet more difficult in the case of the Ruliad, just because it builds up everything. And so you don't get, so one of the things to understand, and this relates to thinginess and mock-up blankets and so on perhaps, is this notion that is very critical to science, as we've pursued science so far, that you can have isolated things in the world, that you can have an experiment you do where you say, this is an experiment, it's on this thing, and nothing else in the world affects the thing I'm looking at. That's that notion of factorizability about the world is something that I think that's what you're going for, this kind of mock-up blanket idea, if I'm understanding correctly. And that notion of factorizability, I think in some fundamental sense, what the Ruliad tells us is there isn't ultimate factorizability. There never will be. The only question is, for the things that we choose to look at, is there some effective theory that we can think of as factorizable? It's at least enough that we can have sort of definite thoughts without always being affected by other things that happen in the world. And it's interesting. More to think about here. I like your, I think this notion of observers who kind of actively pick for themselves the path of predictability, I think is interesting. I still feel like I need to untangle that idea a little bit more. I feel like there's a bit more, and you've kind of indicated that you see there as being some tautological character to it. I kind of feel like it has I would suspect that there is something something interesting which you're effectively taking as axiomatic about observers, and perhaps in a sense, one of the things I'm trying to do right now is to think about what aspects of observers are in fact there, but we've always thought they were obvious. In other words, the idea that there could be pure motion, that's always seemed completely self-evident and obvious, but yet I think it's something one has to derive. And so I'm sort of curious about, as you peel back, what things are there about observers that have always seemed totally obvious to us, but in fact, it might not be that way, and trying to understand that. And that's kind of...
So basically, and he goes on to speak a bit more, but is that this is the next stage of science, is this figuring this out. How do we understand the nature of ourselves and the world, and of beings versus things, and to factorize these different parts of existence, and how and categorize these different parts of existence. This is entirely, this is what sentient singularity theory is very much about. And like I said, it begins with starting to recognize that our perception divides the world into beings versus things, but reality is that things come from beings. The perception of things comes from being perceived by beings always. So it's like there's a directionality to it, to that differentiation. And so, and then it goes on from there, and there's many other ways, different, can get very deep and much more, broad also, as far as just where that idea goes. How do we factorize the world? And factorize existence is a better way of putting it. And that is the next generation. That's the next gen science. But it does require rule changes, and he kind of started to get at this in a way by saying that he predicts that a lot of what is going to be critical to being to internalizing and recognizing and understanding are things that we actually very often have just taken as axiomatic or obvious. And of course that's the case. We're fish looking for water. Like so I mean, it's like, this is we're going to have to admit that some things that are obvious to us must actually be internalized and prioritized and kind of built on, instead of just taken as, well, yeah, that's obvious, like, move on. No, yeah, that's obvious. Like, now we have to base everything on that. And we can't just disregard that as not part of science because it's obvious. Which is kind of the way that we've done things. And that's that. I hope you guys found the stream interesting. I highly suggest watching their entire stream. I hope it didn't go too long. I have no idea exactly how long it's gone. At least 3 hours, probably. But it was a very important one. I hope I did a decent job at explaining, what I was trying to get out, and also what they were trying to convey. I definitely want to thank Stephen Wolfram and Karl Friston and the host of Machine Learning Street Talk for putting out this this interview. It was awesome. I mean, there were so many other clips that I had, and I knew that it would just go on and on and on. And so we got to be selective. But the link is below to their talk, and subscribe to their channel. Please hit the bell notification. If you liked this, hit the like button. If you thought this was valuable, comment any questions or just what you think of the streams in general, or this one, whatever, into the comments below. It help fuel the algorithm, help people see this, help grow the channel a bit. And that is best way to support. Let me see. School is the Matrix. It's worse than the Matrix. Human beings often like to argue. That's true. Intelligence is knowing a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put a tomato in a fruit salad. Yeah, exactly. Memes of Destruction did a great interview, by the way, with Stephen Wolfram, and it's on his channel. Highly suggest checking that out. I actually even asked a question in the chat while they were doing their stream, and Memes asked it of Stephen Wolfram. I think it was the last question, and it was a great talk all around. I highly recommend going and checking it out. But he said that Memes said that in his interview with Wolfram, because I brought up wisdom and its relationship with computational irreducibility, and Memes said the fruit salad comment. But it's true. It's like, wisdom is necessary. Experience is necessary to wisdom, and wisdom is necessary to knowing which choices to make, even with even if you have all the information. And consciousness is knowing that you put a boo-boo when you actually put that tomato in the fruit salad. Yeah, made a boo-boo. Yeah, exactly. Consciousness is perceiving that as a bad decision when you actually go to eat it, experiencing that. So would intelligence be the partition of information and its categorization, while consciousness is the awareness and identification of this partition? Consciousness is the awareness and identification of partition of information. Intelligence, I don't know if it is if you could describe it as the partition of information. It's more like the processing of a part of information, but it's not even the processing of info. It's tough to describe, honestly. It's like it's probably kind of linked to like the physical constraints that you experience while you process information, which when you're processing the information, there are cognitive constraints, mental constraints due to the manner in which information processing takes place, but those constraints are also degrees of freedom, whereas the physical constraints would be just constraints in a way. Is like intelligence is, it's tough to, I don't think we have a good definition of it. We don't have a good definition of it. And I will say this, I can't tell you exactly the best definition of intelligence, but I will tell you that there are two that will work, and you have to pick one. And we could argue over which one works best, but I don't have time to get into which one, into both of those, because I'd have to think about it. But I can tell you from sentient singularity theory that there will be two that work, and you just have to pick one and be consistent. And that's the most important thing. So essentially, will would be like conscious feedback loop between this partition through intelligence and the awareness of it through consciousness. Will is like it's like what motivates you. It's like an intrinsic state of being, which is motivating every action that we take, including cognitive actions. It is the motivator. But it's super connected to every other aspect of being, because it is the motivator and driver of action. It is the motivator and driver of, it is also the constraint in a way of imagination, which is also necessary aspect to self-perception, which is necessary to perception itself and necessary to predictive ability and therefore necessary to choice making, because you can't make choices without making the ability to make predictions. You can't if you can't make any predictions, you can't make any choices, and if you can't make any choices, you can't make any predictions. Necessarily. So it's all super connected to will. Will is like the top of your code. It's like the foundation of the code of sentience is will. Anyways, peace, guys. Thank you, everyone. And subscribe if you haven't. See ya.